Good afternoon, and welcome to National Review Institute's program on the case for American power, why we must lead the free world. My name is Peter Travers. I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees of National Review Institute. I thank you for coming, and I thank those who are watching us live streamed and on C-SPAN. National Review Institute was founded by William F. Buckley Jr. in 1993 to advance the classical conservative principles that we champion in the pages of National Review. The Institute has developed numerous programs and presents a variety of events and conferences and educational seminars across the country, and we sponsor the work of a dozen outstanding NRI fellows. We're convened this afternoon on a wonderful sunny spring day because of extraordinary and extraordinarily awful events taking place half the world away. Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the atavistic purpose of subjugation has riveted the world's attention, as only the gratuitous violence of a totalitarian nation against a peaceful neighbor can do. The world remains aghast at this ongoing atrocity and asks, what can we do? What can we do to prevent such aggression? And appropriately for us this afternoon, what can we do to protect America and to defend our core national interests in a very dangerous world? National Review has been asking these questions of Americans and of the free world for 66 years, and we have some suggestions. We believe there are time-honored and cogent principles. I think Bill might have called them lapidary principles, to which we can refer in this. Our distinguished speakers this afternoon also have some pointed thoughts on these principles and their application, and I look forward to hearing from them. National Review journalism commentary has been unstinting for decades in outrage at the Russian suffocation of Eastern Europe, what the venerable James Burnham called a prison house of nations. We covered Alexander Solzhenitsyn extensively, and the groundbreaking work of Robert Conquest in describing the Holodomor, which was a policy of terror famine initiated by Stalin in the 1930s in a previous attempt to obliterate the Ukrainian nation. 5 million innocent Ukrainians were murdered by that policy. More recently, National Review published a cover story describing the false flag atrocity by which Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999. Shortly thereafter, he initiated the Second Chechen War and razed its capital, Grozny, through indiscriminate bombardment. Sadly, we have become familiar again in Ukraine, as in Syria, as in Grozny, with the Russian policy of civilian mass murder by artillery. I thought the Ukrainian outrage made a restatement of first principles, timely and essential. In March, I wrote a statement which was entitled, "The Wild Beasts Are Real," to review National Review's historic and yet still fresh advocacy for an implacably anti-totalitarian policy. The provocative title comes from a letter written by Whittaker Chambers to Bill in 1954, lamenting how easy it is for us Americans, to think that the beasts are merely entertaining or animated figures of art or film, but regrettably they are not, and Whittaker Chambers had reason to know. Realism and not wish-casting is the essential foundation of American foreign policy. And so the sad episode of Russian revanchism is a kind of teachable moment for us all. When Finland and Sweden lobby for NATO membership, and when the Green Minister of Energy in Germany lobbies for liquid natural gas facilities to be built in an accelerated fashion in the North Sea, when the German socialist, formerly pacifist chancellor announces a tripling of the German military budget overnight, I think we can safely say, by the way, that Germany's very well-deserved 75-year timeout from military and security affairs is over. When these things happen, we know we're in a unique moment, and it's a good time, as Bill would have us do, review first principles. I sometimes think that the conservative project is a kind of remedial education program through which we delicately explain the basic facts of life. Where does our national standard of living come from? Where does our energy come from? You know, we flip the light, we flip the switch, and the light and the electricity, and they flow, and isn't that miraculous? How does that happen? Where does our modern health care come from? Where do these magical devices that eliminate so much pain and increase our mobility, where did they come from? How did we conjure up these miracle drugs that saved us from a dread disease? Most importantly, for our purposes this afternoon, where does our national security come from? Unlike our philosophical antagonists, conservatives recognize that prosperity, energy independence, modern medicine, and national safety from the wild beasts are not givens. These wonders do not arise from serendipity, but rather from the exertions and quite often the sacrifices of brave men and women supported by specific policies founded upon clear thinking about the world as it is and about human beings as we are. So again, what can be done? In the chaos of a violent moment, our scope of action is narrow. But in the long run, we can do a lot. We can prepare better, and we can recommit to those venerable principles that keep America safe and promote freedom. In The Wild Beasts Are Real essay, I list several of these principles, but there are three that deserve a little bit of emphasis. First of all, sound foreign policy does not ask America to range the world in search of monsters to destroy, but it does recognize that parochial insularity is a hazardous indulgence. Recently, a type of neo-isolationism has enjoyed a resurgence among the careless and the historically challenged, and not just on the left, where such thinking has really been customary for at least 50 years, but also, oddly, I think, among some who call themselves a type of conservative. There are several different flavors of this parochial insularity. One flavor seems to suggest that this conflict is somehow Ukraine's fault for seeking to join a defensive alliance to protect it against violent aggression. It seems that somehow that aspiration is itself a provocation to aggression. Rather, it reminds me of a remark that Georges Clemenceau made to those who sought to justify naked aggression in 1914. He said, "En tout cas, ce n'est pas la Belgique qui a envahi l'Allemande." Indeed, it is not Ukraine that has invaded Russia, nor even threatened it. Another less noxious flavor of provincialism echoes the ancient American desire to stay out of all those foreign wars. This is a reasonable impulse and a worthy one, but such an impulse by itself can be a type of wish casting against which Whittaker Chambers warned us. Tyrants do not rest easily within their borders, and averting our eyes from a savage war and the immense human suffering that arises in its wake does nothing to protect America, much less make us great. Hoping the wild beasts stay far away is no more a national security strategy than defund the police is a credible policy for domestic safety. Finally, as if Pearl Harbor and the Cuban Missile Crisis and 9/11 and a worldwide pandemic were insufficient to make the point, our age of instant global connectivity makes it plain that America can be attacked, can be directly affected, Americans can be killed by the actions taken by despots very far away. And this bracing vulnerability will only increase. Of course, careful judgment is called for any exercise of American power, and the justification of such an exercise must be lodged in a persuasive case that America's national interests are meaningfully advanced thereby. National Review and conservatism generally stands for the principle that wisdom in such matters can be discerned through a careful assessment of history and an unsentimental realism about freedom in a predominantly unfree world. NRI fellow Jay Nordlinger will lead a panel on this topic in a few minutes with the Honorable Victoria Coates and Elliot Abrams. A second key principle in the value is the value to America of its alliances. These arrangements are crucial deterrents, they are force multipliers. An array of democratic nations committed to a policy of collective security significantly alters the calculations of expansive tyrants and thereby radically shifts the odds in favor of peace. NATO has been the crown jewel of our alliances. Its remarkable success in keeping the peace for 67 years has ironically masked how effective this alliance has been. A third element of American national security is perhaps the most obvious. Ultimately, the gangster statesmen of the world, which is a wonderfully apt phrase of National Review contributor Paul Johnson, the gangster statesmen are not deterred in their plans by firm remonstrances or by UN Security Council resolutions or even by the threat of economic damage. At the crucial moment when war hangs in the balance, but peace is still possible, that dictators must know that American military power is overwhelming and that American leaders will use it if America's national interests require it. Our military capability is not a given and is built over many years. In particular, as we race into the fully digital world, our military's ability to deploy kinetic power will depend increasingly on the efficacy of our digital tools. American digital innovation, such as has dazzled the world for several decades now, can only systematically arise in a free market economy, indeed an economy that's anchored by a vibrant venture capital community whose underlying culture spawns and rewards nonlinear creativity. In a few moments, my estimable colleagues, John Hillen, will discuss these matters further with Congressman Gallagher. Finally, a word must be said regarding the crucial role of American credibility in fostering peace and protecting our nation. When an American president is caught on a hot mic telling Vladimir Putin, just wait a while till after my election is over for more accommodation of Russian interests in American foreign policy, it suggests weakness, to say the least. When that same American president draws a red line against the use of chemical weapons and then does exactly nothing when thousands are gassed to death, the gangsters notice. She notices. Khamenei notice. Kim notices this. And the world becomes a more savage and a dark place because of such comments. This is not an abstraction. This kind of voting present invited Russia to establish military bases throughout Syria from which they could bomb cities to rubble at their leisure and murder tens of thousands of innocent civilians with barrel bombs. When an American president threatens European allies by implying that our commitment to NATO is somehow a conditional commercial arrangement of some sort, both Europe and the United States are less secure. When an American president is proud of leading from behind or casually and chaotically abandons allies, the world knows that they are much more at risk because America is AWOL. American military power and our alliances with free nations are essential to peace and to America's national security. The credibility of America's leadership is a precious asset, constantly being tested and assessed by expansive tyrants. In the moment of crisis, the free world, the entire world, stops and turns and asks, where are the Americans? We must be there. The Americans must be there, and we must support the victims of the wild beasts, and we must defend our nation and our core interests with unmatched military power and an unsentimental, realistic perspective. This is the stake that National Review hammered into the ground 66 years ago, and to which we welcome all who understand that freedom must be defended in every generation and on many fields. I thank you very much for coming. I hope you'll enjoy the program this afternoon. And now we will shift to Jay. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Feel free to applaud our panelists. I don't want you to. Were these chairs cushy?
Yeah.
I'm Jay Nordlinger. I'm a writer and editor at National Review. And we're going to talk a little foreign policy, or a lot of foreign policy, with two people well equipped for the job. Hello, Lee Edwards. You know them, but I'll introduce them. Victoria Coates is an art historian, as well as a foreign policy analyst. She went to Trinity, Williams, and Penn. She was a deputy national security advisor in the Trump administration. Elliott Abrams was an assistant secretary of state in the Reagan administration. He was about 12 years old, and he went on to...
I was going to say that.
He was truly a child prodigy, and he went on to serve in other administrations and to write several books. He went to Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Before that, he went to the Little Red Schoolhouse in Manhattan. And other illustrious alumni of Little Red include Angela Davis and Robert De Niro. Bit of sad news, despite my levity. Elliott's mother-in-law, Midge Decter, the great Midge Decter, passed away today. Great Cold Warrior, great writer, great woman, founded the Committee for the Free World. Something like that we may need once more. And she did something very interesting. You know, these organizations go on and on, no matter what happens to their original purpose. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, she dissolved the committee, declaring victory. Well, today is May 9th, and therefore Victory Day in Russia and the former Soviet republics. And I want to read a bulletin from the Associated Press. Russian President Vladimir Putin used a major patriotic holiday Monday to again justify his war in Ukraine, but did not declare even a limited victory or signal where the conflict was headed. And this is what Zelensky said in his remarks in Kyiv. He said, "Very soon there will be 2 victory days in Ukraine. We have never fought against anyone. We always fight to defend ourselves. We are fighting for freedom and for our children." And I wonder if we could begin by hearing from our panelists, what is the importance of the Ukraine conflict, of Russia's assault on Ukraine, to the United States? Victoria Coates.
Well, thank you, Jay and Elliott, and all of you for joining us today. I think this is a very timely, important topic for us to discuss, and a conversation that we've really been having for about a decade now of how we define conservative foreign policy. Jay, I think Ukraine has been a remarkable clarifying moment, coming particularly after the chaos of Afghanistan last summer and the prevailing belief in our current administration that this would not happen. And then it did happen. The incredible brutality of Putin, I think, has been shocking to the world. The remarkable courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people has also been shocking to the world. And the fact that Putin did not declare victory today, or lay out the conditions for victory, suggests this may be considerably worse for him than we even know at this point. And so my feeling is that we need clarity from this administration about what their plan is for Ukraine, what their desired end state is, and this whole insistence that, oh, the Ukrainians will define it. Okay, well, then get with the Ukrainians and figure out what that is. And the disarray of the strategy right now was really clarified to me at the end of last month when the president came out one Thursday, made a formal announcement that he was going to request an additional $1.3 billion from the Congress. The following Thursday, the request went up at $33 billion, with no explanation about what changed. Now, am I willing to spend $33 billion to make Putin's life miserable? Probably, but I'd like to know how it's going to be spent and what the, as I said, desired end state is. So I think it's a moment that is going to give us some real clarity about where the United States stands on these issues.
Elliott Abrams.
Pardon me, of course I agree. Let me say first, I'm very pleased to be here. I thank you for the kind words about Midge Decter. He's really a great person. I think it is fair to say that we had not just a kind of holiday from history under Clinton, but it has been 30 years now, 31 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we were getting used to a world in which the threats were not all that great. And slowly but surely, we've been moving in the direction of recognizing them, particularly with respect to China. So Ukraine is, I think, a great awakening for many, many Americans that the world is back to the dangerous interstate system that has existed for literally centuries. We're not getting any free rides. We have real enemies in China, in Russia, and in other places, Iran, North Korea, primarily. And we are not organizing ourselves to deal with these threats. When you look at the defense budget, if I remember correctly, 9% of GDP when John Kennedy entered the Oval Office, and it has fallen below 4%. And of course, it was a much poorer country in 1961 than in 2022. So we're not spending enough on our defense, and we're not thinking carefully enough about what it means. The best example is probably energy independence, which we turned away from a year ago under the Biden administration, and to which we will obviously have to turn back. So I think in the tragedy of so many hundreds of, actually millions of Ukrainians uprooted from their homes is a reminder to us that the world is really dangerous. You might say once again, or you might say still.
Elliot, on energy, you remind me that the California government was scheduled to shut down the last remaining nuclear plant in California. Now the governor is reconsidering, and it seemed to me that he had been, if you'll pardon the expression, mugged by reality.
Yeah.
And,
On a similar thing, there was Jerry Brown, when he was governor the second time, did a whole bunch of things that he had not done.
he was a boy governor like you were a boy assistant secretary.
Well, he
of
was
State.
asked, but didn't you say that X, Y, Z? And his reply was, well, that was yesterday, and this is today.
Yes.
So that, well, it's better. I mean, we should applaud this if he's changing his mind.
We had the Cold War. I was recounting earlier today, Victoria once worked for Donald Rumsfeld. And I said to him in 2002 or 2003, do you think the American public will stick with a war on terror? He said, they stuck with the Cold War. And I said, in some ways, I think we lucked out a bit. He said, it was a close-run thing. And he recalled being ambassador to NATO and speaking or meeting with people, I think, in Portugal. And he was rushed back to Capitol Hill to testify against the Mansfield Amendment, which would have withdrawn U.S. troops from Europe. But look, we had the Cold War, then our maybe little holiday from history, and then the terror war. And I think a lot of people ask, left, right, center, can't we be done? Do we need to do this again? And what do politicians say? They have their lines. We got some nation building to do right here at home. And there's this expression that grew up in recent years on left and right, forever wars, no more forever wars, and so on. Here we go again. And some of us are accused of being Cold War nostalgists. I think rather that we're realists. The late Madeleine Albright said, the United States is the indispensable nation. A lot of Americans don't want to be indispensable. I don't really blame them. And can you explain, Victoria, can you explain, Elliot, why we must be indispensable, if we must be?
If I can jump in. One of the other things I do is I'm chairman of the Vandenberg Coalition. And why did we choose the name Vandenberg? Arthur Vandenberg was an isolationist in the 1930s who believed all of those things. Leave us alone. World War I was a disaster. We shouldn't have gotten involved. We're done now. And then came Pearl Harbor and the Cold War after World War II. And Vandenberg became the most important partner in the Senate for Harry Truman, passing the Marshall Plan and the NATO Treaty. Why? Because he reassessed, I would argue, realistically, the threats that the country faced, which he had misunderstood or underestimated. And he was, again, big enough to say, I got that wrong, and we face a different set of threats now. So, as Victoria said, it is perfectly reasonable to say, $33 billion for Ukraine, okay in principle, but what is it? And it's also reasonable to say, well, if you want to increase the defense budget, by how much, where? Explain it to me, prove it to me. All of that is reasonable because we're talking about taxpayer money. What is not reasonable is continuing to believe that this country does not have strong and brutal enemies out there. And you're living in a dream world if you
Is it our fault, Elliot? Do we provoke them? Do we poke the bear? Do we encircle them? Are we arrogant?
I don't want to have an argument with the Pope right here on this stage. But I think in the case of NATO and Russia, that's really an absurd argument. I mean, all of us have been saying for years, and especially the critics of NATO, hey, nobody's spending 2%. These people, what do they think? They're free riders. They're not organizing. Germany has no army. So what's threatening Russia? These armies that don't exist? The German army in particular? I mean, we all read these stories about their inability to put 4 tanks in a row. So there was no threat to Russia. There was a threat to Putin. And it's not a national security threat. It's the threat of a prosperous, democratic, Slavic country called Ukraine.
Victoria Coates?
I think we might need a little bit of a rebranding exercise, and I'm a proud member of the Vandenberg Advisory Council, is that what we call ourselves? Yep. And, you know, I strongly agree that that is a critical example. But I think as we're communicating with the American people about these issues and why Ukraine matters and why we are indispensable, and while it's hard and expensive, it's also something we absolutely have to do. Explain things in terms that affect people's lives. And one thing that's been very striking to me over the last decade is how topics that would historically be stovepiped from what we'd consider to be foreign policy are now critical to a national security discussion. And I think that's actually the transition. When you say foreign policy or foreign affairs to people, they glaze, they think about the United Nations, faraway countries they may or may not know the names of. But when you say national security and you're talking to people about energy, that's my particular hobby horse, can go on about it for a real long time, but Miranda might come and give me the hook. But also immigration, border security, information. I think the response to the Ministry of Truth that's just been set up over at DHS is visceral, that people understand these are things that are impacting their lives directly, and that as you are paying $6 a gallon at the pump, as the Wall Street Journal reported today, we may be looking at rolling blackouts and power outages over the summer because of the precipitous rush to close down traditional means of generating electricity, that's what's going to be persuasive, that you are explaining things to people in terms that impact their lives. And I think all the polling I've seen on Ukraine put US support at about 80%. That's not close, and it's bipartisan. People have long memories. They understand that the Russians have not been our friends historically, particularly their leadership, not the Russian people, obviously, and that this is somewhere America is going to have to take a stand. And my question just then is, how are we going to do that?
Victoria, do you think this support may fade? Zelensky said something kind of moving the other day. I think he was speaking with a reporter from Time magazine. He said, people are interested in us now, but when they get tired of us, they'll scroll away and read about something else.
No, I mean, that is, I think, a real danger, Jay. And one thing I would hope somebody who's sitting in the National Security Council staff now would be working on is how if Ukraine can prevail and survive as a sovereign democratic state, what is the hard work that will have to go into breaking the real culture of corruption in that government? And is this an opportunity to really rebuild it as something that can shake off that very painful history? Right now, I think they really will hold the world's attention. The longer they can hold off the Russians. Remember, we're in whatever it is, day 75 of the 3-day war.
It's amazing they're still standing.
Yeah,
amazing there's a Ukraine today.
And if Putin is taking even more severe losses than we really know, that will be a compelling story.
Well, there's been a buzz phrase in recent years, pivot to China. I refer to them as the people who say this as the pivoters. And Elliot, you quoted a song, an old song in a podcast we did a while ago when you were explaining about foreign policy and international relations. I'll get the body parts wrong. I think a lot of us learned this song and can't, but the thigh bone's connected to the bone. And you quoted this song about how things are connected, And, it doesn't take a Metternich, a Kissinger, or an Abrams. How do you like that? To figure out.
I'm thinking if that's a compliment or an insult.
I'm not sure.
To figure out that Russia and Ukraine have something to do with China and Taiwan.
Yep.
The world is small. As Bill Buckley would say, dilate on that, Elliot, if you like.
First, there's a question of, the overarching question of American credibility. The Australians, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Vietnamese, I could go on, understand that their fate is tied to the impression in Xi Jinping's mind of whether we are a reliable ally. And the same is true
We, the United States.
We, the United States. And the same is true of the Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Poles, Czechs, etc. What is the United States going to do if X or Y happens? If you're Xi Jinping, you're on the one hand, you are looking at this, I think, and you're saying this 3-day war has been going on for more than a couple of months now. Maybe that would happen if I invade Taiwan. Who knows how good my Army and Navy are, since they've never been in combat. And he's also seen the very sharp and increasing sanctions. And he must be aware of the vulnerability of the Chinese economy. On the other hand, he also saw the President Biden said, essentially on day one, well, we're not going to get directly involved because on the other side there's a nuclear power. So he may be thinking to himself, so if I can get into Taiwan fast, this is Putin's mistake, couldn't take Kyiv, I can take Taipei fast. The Americans won't do anything because of what President Biden said. So I think the critical factor here is very centrally what people make of the reliability of the United States. That is what ties all these things together. Just to give one other example, the Abraham Accords. I think there's an enormous amount of credit that goes to the President Trump and the Trump administration for the Abraham Accords. But in the minds of the Arab countries who are continuing to build the Abraham Accords today, one of the reasons that they're doing that is that they view Israel as a more reliable ally against Iran than the United States. So all of these things, I think, relate back to the question of the judgment that friend and foe make about American reliability and credibility.
Elliot, before I go to Victoria, I want to ask you something having to do with China. You recall at the very beginning of the George W. Bush administration, first term, he blurted out that the United States would defend Taiwan. And I remember asking a national security official, did he mean to say that? Did he mean to change U.S. policy, or was it a mistake? And this fellow smiled and quoted an old advertising slogan, "Only his hairdresser knows for sure." Is it time for an end to strategic ambiguity? Or personally, I doubt that the US would lift a finger to come to Taiwan's aid. But I wouldn't want it tested. What do you say?
First, the Chicago Council on World Affairs did a poll last year, September, October, and asked people across the country, do you think the United States should send troops, use American troops to defend Taiwan? If you would ask me what percentage will say, yes, we should do that, I would have said, I don't know, 15, 20? It was 52. 52%, and that was before Ukraine. The only hesitation I have about saying yes is
Yes to an end to strategic
yes,
ambiguity?
we should end strategic ambiguity is we need to mean it. The worst thing we could possibly do is bluff. Because, pardon me, if we say we have a commitment, an Article 5 type commitment, and we don't do it, we don't defend Taiwan, then every commitment we have around the world is really deeply and badly undermined.
Victoria, as I recall, Article 5 of the NATO treaty, in the NATO alliance, has been invoked only once by the Europeans after 9/11. And so in a sense, the Afghan war was an Article 5 war. I wouldn't want to see that tested much further either myself. You know, people said during the Cold War, what if the Sovs, as some of us call them, what if they moved into West Berlin? I'm glad that wasn't tested. How solid do you think NATO is?
Well, I think it's much more solid now than it was 5 years ago, and I think that was actually something
Or 3 months ago, maybe.
Well, I actually think, not to give too much credit to my old boss, but President Trump's pressure on NATO, and the then buildup of NATO spending, and the last NATO summit that I was tracking with him, Stoltenberg came out at the end and said, we got more work done this week than we've gotten done in 10 years. And that is because everyone is taking their security much more seriously. And as you said, this is...
And they made a pledge in 2014, did they not?
Right.
After Putin annexed Crimea and started the Donbass war.
But they didn't honor a lot of those pledges. And, going back to the eternally fascinating topic of Donald Rumsfeld, I remember going through his NATO papers, and he was complaining about European fecklessness and refusal to take their security seriously in 1974. So this was not...
So did Harold Brown.
Yep, it was not in any way new.
So did Robert Gates.
One other quick factoid about DR is he did not realize Article 5 had been invoked for, his memory was weeks. And here was a former NATO ambassador who was acting as Secretary of Defense when this happened. Because I said to him, was it sort of an amazing moment? He said, no, I was so busy I didn't know. But I do agree that Afghanistan was in many ways a testing ground of a NATO war. And I think one of the really damaging things about how it ended was that we were not consulting with our NATO allies, despite their participation for 20 years. One point I wanted to make about China, though, which I think is complementary to what Elliot said, is clearly China is our generational issue. And particularly coming out of the COVID crisis, again, the American people know this is a problem, and they are seeing the snarled supply chains, and they're seeing the awful videos out of Shanghai, and that this is going to be our big struggle. But importantly, it is not our only struggle. I think seeing terror as the critical issue we had to confront after 9/11, of course it was, but became almost an excuse to look away from China. That's how we got China, was thinking we only had one problem set at a time. And so, we do have some good friends here in town who are insisting we cannot play a role in Ukraine or Europe because we must focus all of our resources in China. It doesn't work that way. It's the same with the Middle East. You can say I'm pivoting away from the Gulf, away from the Middle East because I've got to focus on China. Well, what is China's single largest source of energy? Saudi Arabia. They're Saudi's biggest customer. If I want to influence China, which will never have the kind of energy dominance that the United States could have if we put our minds to it, wouldn't I want to have very strong influence over Saudi Arabia? Wouldn't I want the Saudis to see me as a partner and a friend? Because if I want to influence China, I need to influence the energy coming out of the Gulf. So you can't take this piecemeal. I think if you do, that's when you really, really wind up with a problem.
Guys, you hear the words interventionist and anti-interventionist. People say so-and-so's an interventionist, so-and-so's an anti-interventionist. And I object to those terms, a little like pro-war and anti-war. I mean, who in the world would be pro-war except for a psychopath, you know? And it seems to me that most people are against intervention in most cases, and for it in a few painful ones. We were talking earlier today about public opinion and the issue of persuasion. Voters, citizens are persuadable with good leadership and good arguments. And so I was thinking about the strains of isolationism in the country. I think some of it is understandable. I think some people are dug in. Others are not dug in, are they? Dug into their position. And they're open to, well, what are the needs? What's the U.S. interest? What are the pros and cons? What are the risks? And so on. There's something to be said for good politicking, good persuading, good arguing, isn't there, Alan?
There is, and let's sum it up in one word: leadership. How do you persuade? How are people persuaded? For example, just take the need for a larger defense budget. It's not obvious. The defense budget is gigantic, right? Huge. And people hear all the time about
We have a huge debt and deficit.
We have a huge debt deficit, and people hear about waste, fraud, and abuse. So somebody, and that's a member of Congress, a senator, but best of all, the president, has to explain, yeah, but the planes are often older than their pilots. Yeah, but our Navy is diminishing in size under the president's budget while China's Navy is growing. The president's budget calls for a 4% increase in the defense budget. You tell me what inflation is going to be. So it's an actual, real decrease. Somebody should explain that. I mean, people don't wake up in the morning and say, talk to me about the defense budget. And I think people do recognize, as I talk to members of Congress and ask them about, conversations back home in the district, everybody gets China. This is not an esoteric, faraway country of which we know little. So I think this has been missing frequently over the last 10, 20 years. I mean, in and out, sometimes good leadership, sometimes not. Certainly this notion that we need to be the leading country in the world, we need to be the most powerful country militarily, was not really what you got, I would argue, from President Obama. So that is what we need now, I think, at least as much as we have needed it since the end of the Cold War. Clear, strong explanations by the president of the need for American leadership. I'll just add one other thing. There is a form of isolationism that is, I think, particularly pernicious, and it is one that talks down what is being defended. It's the one that, it's the kind that says, who are we to tell other people what to do? Who are we? What are we defending here? This horrible racist society. And that's one of the, really, I think, one of the most awful forms of isolationism. And then it leads you to say it is related to we have to rebuild America before we can do anything overseas, which is, just completely, that is a really foolish and silly argument. But the argument about what exactly are our interests and therefore our responsibilities to ourselves, it's a complicated argument, and that's why we need political leaders to explain it.
Well, I think we need something between the two poles you define, Jay, between, hawk and dove. And I've often thought we needed a third point that was an owl.
Jack Kemp used to say, I'm a dove, but a heavily armed dove. Yeah.
But I'm thinking we could be owls and show the kind of restraint that I think most do want to exercise over interventionalism, and at the same time recognize that it is at times necessary. And again, that to go back to the Ukraine requests, that's what I found so disturbing about that, was the lack of leadership that you define. I'm old enough to remember when 1.3 billion was a lot of money. And 33, then you're really getting to real money. And how can you be that mixed in your messages and expect to bring people with you and persuade them that, yes, this is a difficult time economically, but this is money well invested if we can get to our desired outcome, which is Putin not invading his neighbors. And that seems to me not too much water to carry. But the current administration isn't doing it, and I think that is leading to just a very deep sense of unease in the country.
Victoria, on this ornithology we were doing, with the hawks and doves and owls, it's not, in my understanding, it's not that the hawks are reckless, not warmongers, but the hawks traditionally have had a very strong understanding of deterrence and what it takes to keep the peace. And that's laudable, isn't it?
Well, then our whole theme today is peace through strength. And the problem is that frequently gets hijacked to peace at all costs, which is no peace at all. It would be subjugation. And to achieve peace through deterrence is doing the hard work that Elliot was talking about. Our friend Jerry Hendricks is here, has done tremendous work on this topic in terms of rebuilding the Navy. You've got to be willing to invest, and you've got to make the case for that. And when you're running around making announcements like our top priority is to move the entire military onto electric vehicles, people don't take you seriously. And especially if you don't have a plan to generate all that electricity, which they do not. That means you're not prioritizing the true function of the U.S. military, which is to be the most lethal force in the history of the planet. We have wonderful young men and women in uniform who are willing to take that charge, but we're not doing them a good service if we are not doing the hard work as policymakers to make sure that money is properly invested.
Well, in our society, we used to talk and think a lot about nuclear war. My father, who grew up here in Washington, D.C., there were all sorts of air raid drills and hiding under desks and so on. There was a movie, I think I was in high school, The Day After, with Jason Robards, I think. There was a famous Time magazine cover, Thinking the Unthinkable, showed a nuclear explosion. I think the piece was by Jonathan Schell, who wrote a best-selling book. And, that was then, And people are thinking about this kind of thing now, thinking the unthinkable now with Putin. What if he gets desperate? What if his pride comes into play? I mean, no one's dropped one of these things since we did in August 1945. That taboo is held for an amazingly long time. Pakistan and India are nuclear armed. What about this question of Putin, Russia, Ukraine, and nukes? If he uses one, do we sit and say, well, Ukraine's not a NATO country, too bad for them. Lucky for the Balts, lucky for the Poles, and so on. What about this unthinkable thing, Elliot?
Pardon. Well, first, it's a reminder of the importance of having a nuclear arsenal. If they were worthless, you would not see the Russians and the Chinese building, modernizing at the expense of enormous amounts, and they're doing it. We've not been doing it, and so first we need to think about that. What is the condition of the nuclear arsenal? Secondly, I think it is right for the government not to answer your question in detail. and say, you know, we will do the following, partly because we have allies we would need to bring in. I would like to think that this step, or another one you might take, which is chemical warfare, is a step that would lead, if not overnight, within a period of months or a year or two, to the removal of Vladimir Putin by people in Russia, whether in the military or the FSB, who would be able to see and understand what he's doing to their country.
Maybe his bigs would refuse a nuclear order.
It's conceivable. It is conceivable. And maybe they wouldn't. And if that were true, then I think we would have to reconsider, first of all, obviously the nature of the sanctions, which are still not what they could be. But then I think we would have to consider the question of directly helping to defend Ukraine.
We have a couple of minutes. I want to ask one more thing. These war crimes in Ukraine, pretty hard to read about. Imagine what they must be to endure. And you two are professionals. You're foreign policy professionals. You're practitioners. And I think of, for
National
example...
security, Jay.
Well, that's for another panel maybe. And I think of, for example, emergency room doctors. I've never been one, but I imagine they see the ghastliest stuff, ghastly things. And then they go to the movies and have dinner, and it's what they do. I want to know whether you two are sickened by this. If there's I myself would have a hard time being coolly professional. Of course, you have to do that when you're actually in office or hold positions of responsibility. But it's just it's ghastly stuff, is it not? You know what I'm driving at, Victoria?
I think so, Jay. I mean, it is, and it should be sickening, and we can't look away, and we can't pretend it's not happening, and that it's an abstract. It is real, and it is a demonstration of the truly evil nature of some elements on this planet, and so I think it is critical to recognize it. The question I would have is, what mechanism do we have to respond? And it was one reason the red line in Syria was so important. Elliot mentioned the chemical weapons. When Assad's that particular use of chemical weapons went unanswered by the United States, it sent a terrible message that this would be tolerated. And Putin was watching that closely. You could say he was potentially complicit in it. And then in the two strikes that we had in the Trump administration, and I'd be very worried that he would be willing to escalate.
Just one more comment on that. The brutality. There is an old line that an army reflects the society from which it comes. And we are seeing a brutal and corrupt army, and it is a reminder of the brutality and corruption of the regime and the society from which it is coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria Coates and Elliot Abrams. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Rich Lowry, and I'm joined here on stage by Jerry Hendricks. Jerry is a former naval aviator, a original and committed navalist, and the author of the book To Provide and Maintain a Navy. And we're supposed to scoot over, I think? Okay. Scoot over a little. Is this good? All right. Getting our stage directions back there. So we're going to talk a little bit about American power and the U.S. Navy and what kind of Navy we need, both the number of ships and the nature of those ships. But first of all, Jerry, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. So obviously the theme of this conference is American power, making the case for American power. How important historically and today is the United States Navy to American power and its projection?
So I think it's important to understand the American system that we've created. So we have this, for lack of a better term, sort of this globalized system of trade that we talked about for the first 150 years of our existence, about free trade and free movement across the seas and the ability to send ships across unhindered. And then after 1945, when we emerged from the war with 6,700 ships in the U.S. Navy, I mean, it's an incredible number to go from 470 ships on December 7th to 6,700 a few years later. But we emerged, and there was no one to challenge us. And so what we had talked about for the better part of our first 150 years, we then made manifest. So free trade, unhindered movement, no piracy, the ability of building larger and larger and larger ships, container ships, cruise ships that you all see now. Those all exist because the sea is free and the sea is safe. So we've built this international system, and now we're beginning to see its erosion. So in the last few years, not only have we seen piracy start to creep up, but we're also starting to see nations like Russia and China begin to challenge the very concept of the free sea, which is injurious to their interests. China would like to claim the South China Sea. Russia wants to claim the Arctic Ocean because they don't like the idea not only of free trade that they cannot control, they also don't like the idea of freedom, the idea that comes transmitted. The sea has become a vector for the transmission of a philosophy that's injurious to their interests. So as we see the decline of the Navy, we're seeing an erosion of that system, and I don't think we have a full appreciation of it as a society.
So the history of this is, we might have some friends on the right say, oh, what suckers are we? Why are we burdened with the cost of providing these free seas and all the benefits that come from it? But the history from our immediate predecessor in this position, the British, is actually being in the position to provide those goods, not just good for the world and your allies, it's good for yourself and your own power and promoting your own interests.
Yeah, if you look at the size of the global world product in 1945, and you see the exponential growth of that over the last 70 years because of this investment that we made, then you can't say it's injurious. I mean, it's to our benefit. It has been totally to our benefit. We've created a commercial trading system which allowed us to grow in power and influence as a nation. And by the way, we've been bringing our allies and friends along. They've all benefited. If you look at, for instance, some key indicators, like, for instance, global literacy. Global literacy has climbed dramatically in the last 70 years. If you look at the people who exist below the extreme poverty level, that number has shrunk dramatically over the last 70 years. So in each instance, as you look at this idea of free trade, being able to move where you take goods where they can produce cheaply and move them to places where they're desired at a higher price across the ocean at a very efficient economical model, then it's been additive to all the experience of all of mankind. But again, we've taken it for granted. We've made an assumption about the oceans, and now that assumption's being challenged.
So let's get to that erosion. So how many ships did we have at the end of the Cold War, and where are we now?
So, the Cold War high was 594 ships during the Reagan administration, and then 1989 came along, and we immediately started gutting the Navy. I mean, we declared a peace dividend, and the Navy, in just the first couple of years, cut 150 ships. So we were down to 450 ships in just less than 3 years. And then by 1997, we had crashed through 400. We were at 350. 2003, we went through 300 ships, and we bottomed out during the Obama administration at 271 ships in 2015.
So that's the world's sole superpower with 271 ship Navy.
Yeah, and the fact is we had still these defined interests. So if you went and asked the regional combatant commanders, Indo-PACOM, the EUCOM commander, SOUTHCOM commander, they had identified these 18 maritime regions of the world where the U.S. had these predominant national interests to preserve trade. To be able to maintain naval presence and uphold our interests in those, we needed about 150 ships underway on any given day. We did that in the Cold War. We sort of set the standard of the cop on the beat. Then, the Navy was just screaming for about 20 years trying to do this. About 2012, we started to collapse. We no longer could maintain over 100 ships out there. Today, we keep about 75 ships out and underway, and that's just not sufficient. So we started to see the erosion of our interests, the Black Sea, for instance, the Arctic, for instance, where you're starting to see other people's interests start to intrude upon those free seas and sort of the decline of freedom in those areas.
So rough back of the envelope calculation, how big should the Navy be? How many ships do we need?
So the 355 ship number that's been around, by the way, since the Obama administration, that is an Obama number. December 17th, as he was leaving office, his Department of the Navy issued the 355 number. The Trump administration came out and gave us a range between 400 to 500 ships. And then in 2014, one of the chiefs of naval operation in congressional testimony, when he was sort of pinned down, how many ships do you really need? He says, about 450. So that's about the right numbers, around 450 ships. 355 is your minimum to meet all of your presence requirements on a day-to-day basis. But if you get pressed, if you get stressed, if a war happens like what we're seeing in Ukraine, you're going to see that number climb to the 450 range very quickly. So my number that I've been using in my own calculations, about 456 ships is the requirement. And then we can break down subcategories underneath that.
So we'll get into what kind of ships and what composition of the force should be. But let's say we get to 456. To get to 456, how big would the overall defense budget need to be given the importance of other services? And John Hillen and Congressman Gallagher are going to get into this more in detail, but broad numbers, broad parameters, how big a defense budget are we talking about?
So if we use a historic standard of 4% of GDP, that seems to be a number we all come back to. You're suddenly right around $1 trillion a year in defense spending. In actuality, our Cold War average was about 4.58% across the entirety of the Cold War. And so there you're looking at somewhere in the $1.2 to $1.3 trillion range. But the fact is if we turn that on tomorrow, say the Congress just says, okay, well, I'm going to give you that amount of money, the defense industrial base we have today cannot absorb it, which is why the 2018 National Defense Commission said we need 5% year-over-year growth. That 5% becomes plannable and allows the industrial base to plan to absorb it, to hire the additional workers, to invest in additional infrastructure. One of the challenges we have today is we'd like to build more ships, but quite frankly, our industrial base isn't set up right now. We are struggling to go from 2 submarines a year to 3 submarines a year. We would struggle to go from 2 destroyers a year to 3 destroyers a year because we don't have the workers in place. The economy changed because we divested out of those heavy industries during the 1990s. We need some time to sort of spool up the great engine of democracy again.
So let me bracket that for a minute, and let's talk about what ships you think we need. So obviously, around the turn of the 20th century, battleships were the huge thing. Dreadnoughts, and I got the bigger dreadnought, more advanced dreadnought. Yours is antiquated now. You need a bigger and better dreadnought, and on it went. In World War I, instead of having a massive climactic battle with battleships, you had Jutland, which you could argue is inconclusive. I have a British friend who has an old propaganda poster on his wall. He's like, no, Rich, it was a glorious British victory. I have the poster here to show you. But then World War II, what are battleships used for? Mostly to shell islands and whatnot, right? And it's aircraft carriers and subs. Also in World War I, subs, unexpectedly, this relatively cheap, not very glamorous warship that had a huge role and a potentially decisive one. So our aircraft carriers now, what battleships were then, a big sort of prestige platform that is not necessarily going to be useful in the conflict of today or tomorrow.
Well, for people who have read my writings, then I have some real problems with aircraft carriers today. Not because of what they could be. They actually could be extremely relevant in a future warfight. But we have failed to invest in the essential element of the aircraft carrier, which is the carrier air wing. So it's not, you can have the biggest aircraft carrier in the world, and we do, and we have 10 of them, and they're fantastic. But the fact of the matter is the air wing is limited in the range.
What's an air wing?
So the air wing is composed of about 65 aircraft today, F-18 Hornets and F-35 Lightning IIs that are primary strike assets of the air wing. They take off, they're armed, they fly a distance, and they hit something, whether it's another aircraft or it's dropping a bomb on another ship or a land target. The problem that we have is that those aircraft, which used to be long range, so in the past, in the Cold War, we had A-6 Intruders and A-3 Sky Warriors, which were 1,000-mile long, could fly out 1,000 miles and drop bombs. Today, we can fly between 500 and 600 miles. And the Chinese have created a whole battery of missiles that can hold us off 900 miles away from their shore. So that's an upside down and underwater mortgage, that we're sort of in with the Chinese, where they pressed us off farther than what we can hit. So if we were going to keep the aircraft carrier relevant, we would be investing in a different air wing that would have longer range aircraft, and we're not doing that right now. We're not even having a serious conversation about it. What that's done is it's forced us in planning to look at submarines. So we have these 4 Ohio-class, what we call guided missile submarines, SSGNs, which can carry 155 Tomahawk missiles, each one of those about 1,000 nautical miles in length. And those are the most feared ships in the world right now. If you have an Ohio-class SSGN surface and spin its radar, sort of everyone in the local area notices and sort of sucks in a breath. So submarines have emerged because of their long-range strike potential. And we're making some significant investments in now what we call the Virginia Block 5, the 5th variant of the Virginia-class submarine, which is going to be able to carry not only Tomahawks, but also these new conventionally prompt strike hypersonic missiles, which are very difficult to defend against, if not impossible to defend against. So that seems to be the direction that the technology is going at the high end, the warfighting end of our naval fleet design.
But the emphasis, given what the Chinese are doing with and others are doing with missiles, will be on distance and your ability to strike and strike with precision from a distance.
That's correct. So you want to make sure that you can fly the farthest distance and that your weapon system is most survivable, that cannot be shot down. And right now, because of hypersonics, not only are they super fast, they come in faster than Mach 5, but they're coming in maneuvering. So the hypersonic glide body, HGV, has the ability to maneuver in the terminal phase, and so it's not ballistic, so you're going to have difficulty shooting it down. That's why we're paying so much attention to the Chinese and Russian investments in these capabilities, because they're also survivable coming against us. We're moving into a hypersonic competition right now. But the hypersonics we're going to have are going to be coming off from some of our surface craft, like the 3 Zumwalt-class destroyers, but also our new Block 5 Virginias.
So subs, you addressed aircraft carriers, anything else about the force?
Well, I think the thing is to understand that the Navy has a unique peacetime mission. So the Navy does show the flag where we're out there upholding U.S. interests and demonstrating where we have an interest. Submarines are not really that good, for obvious reasons, in doing presence, because if you can't see it,
periscope.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea of what is going to be out there showing the flag for the United States, using a high-end Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, which is a fantastic ship, and I love them, but the fact is that used to be a frigate role. We don't have any frigates in the United States Navy today, but we're about to start building them. So the new Constellation-class frigate has been designed, and we're going to start getting those into the fleet in the mid-2020s. That becomes your low end. So the daily show the flag, I'm out here and about, the cop on the beat, is probably going to be migrating to that frigate force going forward. It will have a wartime role doing things like convoy escort, taking things to Europe or to our allies in Japan or in the Pacific. But the fact is that low-end force has a role on the day-to-day operations of our fleet, and we need to make sure that we understand that and properly fund it.
So coming back to the industrial base, which you hit on a little while ago, it's just shocking what trouble we have repairing our subs now, and how the industrial base has degraded. Hypersonics, one issue with keeping up with the Chinese and Russia on hypersonics is not just that we didn't invest what we should have in the Obama years and at other times, it's just we don't have enough wind tunnels, for instance. So these basic ingredients of building and maintaining a high-tech force that we don't have, or we've fallen down on. And going back to the British example, a couple of the signs that the British were beginning to fall was one, when they didn't have enough ships anymore to patrol the Pacific on their own, so they had to have an alliance with the Japanese, which was a little awkward, but they just needed the Japanese help because they had the ships that the British didn't. And then two, when, I don't know, I guess it was maybe between the wars, when suddenly they just couldn't make top-line stuff anymore. They hadn't invested, their industrial base was eroding, and they're no longer making top-of-line equipment. And do you fear that we have let ourselves get into a similar place?
Yeah, so we failed to, I always use the golden goose analogy, the Aesop's fable of the golden goose. You never want to kill the golden goose. Well, we did that. We killed off a lot of golden gooses in the 1990s during the drawdown. The fact is that graving docks are probably the most crucial infrastructure that we have in the Navy shipbuilding, because only a graving dock can make a ship. I can have lots of ships, but if I don't have enough graving docks, I can't ramp up dramatically. You talked about the hypersonic wind tunnels. Those are the golden goose of hypersonic technology. If you fail to invest in your research and development centers or in your research universities, and you don't have enough hypersonic glide or wind tunnels to be able to do the experimentation and the development of the capabilities, then you're not going to be able to mass produce when the time is right. So in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, we had like 9 public shipyards in the United States Navy. Today we have 4, and they're all under-resourced, and we're trying to get money into them to modernize their dry docks. We actually have less capacity to repair. We have submarines, a large degree of the force, I think it would be shocking to most people, of how much of our submarine force is unable to dive right now because it's lost its dive certification because they're behind on maintenance. Same thing happened with our Ticonderoga class cruisers. They got
Wait a
behind.
minute, so our subs can't dive?
That's right. Well, after the loss,
Seems like a problem.
it's a huge problem. So after the loss of the USS Thresher back in like 1963, we had these very strict rules, sub-safe rules, that if you're not certified across the green board, you can't take the sub beneath the surface. We just will not risk our sailors. Well, the fact is you have to do maintenance in a very specific time scale. We have fallen behind on that. If the members of the press can just Google the USS Helena or the USS Boise, they will come up with some true horror stories about submarines that have been sidelined for years on end because we were unable to get them in for regular maintenance. So we need to add capacity in ship repair, and we need to add capacity in ship building. We need to do the same thing in aviation. Aviation fell behind in doing depot-level maintenance on aircraft, and so readiness of the aviation force fell off as well because, again, we under-resourced maintenance. It's not just building things, it's maintaining them after you've built them.
So do you have a brief for the Navy over and above the other, besides your institutional loyalty, where you served, is it more important than having a big army, more important than the Air Force, or do you need all of them just in the right balance?
So as you know, because you read the book, To Provide and Maintain, I'm making an argument now that we've sort of reached this point where we can no longer afford to be all things to all peoples, which we did. We pursued for a long period of time as the unipolar moment that we could be a great continental power and a great sea power simultaneously. Now we're $30 trillion in debt. We're stressed strategically, and we need to kind of make up our mind and prioritize how we're going to proceed. I think that our priorities going forward in the future, specifically looking at the great power competition with China and then Russia at a lesser extent, even with Ukraine, I say Russia is still number 2, that we have to take a sea power strategy and start investing in that aspect of our national defense strategy first and primarily.
And talk a little bit about where the Chinese are with their Navy now. Obviously, it's been a major investment. They have a blue water Navy on the verge of if they don't already have a nuclear triad. Where are the Chinese?
So the Chinese are at 355 ships now. So the goal that we set for ourselves, the Chinese met last year. They have 19 major shipyards, one of which has the production capacity of all of our shipyards combined.
And is that just a matter of national focus? We're going to invest in this and do it, or is there any other?
So they made a decision back when we zigged and they zagged. So in the 1980s, when we started underinvesting in shipyards, we pulled subsidies from civilian shipbuilding as well as military shipbuilding beginning in the late 1980s. The Chinese decided to go big. So if you look at where the major shipbuilders are, they're in Asia and there's some in Europe right now, but Asia is the place where most of the large container ships are going. China made a heavy industry investment in shipbuilding, and they dominate that particular area. And now the thing is they build the container ships, they build oilers, they build virtually everything that floats. And it's very easy for them to create a Navy because they have such a large civilian shipbuilding that the Navy is really kind of a 10% spinoff of everything else they're doing. We predominantly build Navy ships in the United States, and we struggle to do that because we don't have a parallel civilian shipbuilding industry here. That's an area that I think we have to get into. So the China at 355, they're heading towards 450, and they're going to get there very quickly by the end of the decade, we expect. They're on their 3rd aircraft carrier now, and they've gone from sort of an older design of an aircraft carrier to what we call a catapult and a resting gear aircraft carrier like ours. So they're starting to do the experimentation with that. They are going to emerge as a major sea power within the decade, and they'll be able to start throwing that weight around the Western Pacific and challenging our position there.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, Jerry Hendricks, go Navy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there. So my name is John Hillen, and I'm here with Congressman Mike Gallagher, who has just had a travel day from hell and has made it just on time. You know, back in the day, Marines went to work before 3:30 in the afternoon.
Not anymore.
I guess.
Yeah.
But
We're on the Air Force schedule now.
Is that right? Many of you know of Congressman Gallagher. So he's a congressman from Wisconsin. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee and now the HISI, the House Select Committee on Intelligence, and is also a writer and thinker on all the things we're talking about today. So we're very grateful to have him to talk about some things today. We were just reminiscing outside about two seminal events that happened in this room in the press club, which I think we should turn to, because I want to start with deterrence and integrated deterrence. We've heard from our first panel about the need for the U.S. to be engaged in a muscular fashion in the world, not reckless, not imprudent, but leading. And the definition of leadership requires that you generate followership. And so the U.S. out leading in the world. And then we heard from the last panel that you need wherewithal. You need wherewithal for deterrence. The new administration has a concept called integrated deterrence. You wrote an op-ed about it in the Washington Post. Is it unfair if I describe your op-ed as saying that integrated deterrence seems just like a slogan and not like a real policy? How would you describe? Do we have enough wherewithal to deter the aggression we need to deter to protect our interests in the world today?
Well, first of all, John, thank you for having me. Thank you for being flexible. My flight was supposed to leave at 7 a.m., and because I could not get a light to turn off, that flight probably still hasn't left Green Bay. So I scrambled to get on another flight. I went home and I was going to change into a suit, but my daughter, who's nearly 2 years old, has now discovered in the last 12 hours how to open doors. So this was a crisis at home. It's like in Jurassic Park when they learn that the velociraptors are smart and they're testing the defenses. She's a very clever girl.
So your power to deter at home
yes,
just completely
limited, very
disappeared.
Disappeared. Another one on the way, so we're going to move from man to man to zone. My problem with integrated deterrence, I guess there's a few problems with it.
Okay.
One, it's a new bit of jargon, and the last thing we need is more jargon in the military lexicon, let alone more acronyms to add to that jargon. In our orientation as new members of Congress 6 years ago, we all went up to Harvard, Democrats and Republicans, and Graham Allison gave a talk where he said something that I thought was quite interesting. He described the Pentagon as having acronymphomania. Its obsession with acronyms and jargon knows no bounds. So every time you sort of add a new phrase to the lexicon, my spider senses start tingling. And I do think it is a clever phrase designed to cover for cuts to conventional hard power. And consider what they're proposing to integrate into deterrence, as if these things had never been integrated before into military deterrence. Allies, technology, and soft power. The basic idea is that by integrating those three things better into conventional hard power, we can get more defense at less cost. It's a very seductive idea. Yeah. Allies. Okay, I would argue that our allies will follow and step up to the plate if we are willing to lead and invest in our defense. And furthermore, we pursue a strategy of extended deterrence where we extend deterrence to our allies. So if we cut hard power, I would argue you're undermining your ability to get your allies on board for whatever you want them to be on board. The defense of Taiwan is foremost in my mind. And as you go around the regions of the world, even if I grant that in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, our European allies are more galvanized than they've been in recent years, in the Middle East, our allies are miffed in many respects. We seem to be abandoning the logical framework of the Abraham Accords and trying to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal at whatever cost is necessary, even to the point of ignoring the Iranian regime's continued attempts to assassinate former high-level U.S. officials on American soil. And in Indo-PACOM, I do not think we are moving with any sense of urgency to get, for example, the basing agreements we need with key allies in order to have a coherent strategy to defend Taiwan. So that's allies. Technology. What technology is going to be fielded within the next 5 years, within the 5-year defense plan, within the FYDP, that's going to solve our most stressing national security problems? The Pentagon's talking about JADC2. JADC2 won't be done within the FYDP. The J is supposed to stand for joint all-demand command and control. If it's joint, then why are all the branches doing their own version of JADC2? And then finally, when it comes to soft power, if integrated deterrence represents an attempt to bring Treasury and Commerce and State Department into the thought process of the Pentagon in ways that have never been done before and solve the interagency mess or the bureaucracy that gets in the way of sound national security planning, then why can't you find a reference to integrated deterrence in any document outside the Pentagon? Why doesn't the Pentagon incorporate Commerce and Treasury into its wargaming over scenarios like Taiwan? So I'm left to conclude that integrated deterrence is a smokescreen for cutting conventional hard power. What needs to be integrated into deterrence, in my opinion, is more conventional hard power within the next 5 years. Final thing, I'm sorry to go on here. Integrated deterrence, I would argue, was tested. The perfect test of integrated deterrence happened in Ukraine. We deliberately led with soft power and with the threat of sanctions. It was relentless diplomacy combined with the threat of sanctions that was going to deter Vladimir Putin, notwithstanding what the president said recently about sanctions were never intended to deter. That was a lie. We deliberately led with soft power, and it failed. And the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs admitted to me in questioning that the only thing that possibly could have deterred Vladimir Putin would have been to put more hard power in his path. Now, we'll never know, admittedly. Those who write about deterrence and study deterrence know you always confront the problem of a determined aggressor. More to the point, you can't prove a counterfactual. But my belief is that hard power deters. Soft power can play a supporting role, but it would be naive to put all of our eggs in the basket of soft power, and that's my concern.
And we've heard we don't have enough of it. When I got to Europe as an Army officer in the late 1980s, we had 360,000 troops in Europe. And of course, now we're down. My regiment, 2nd Cav, is the only Army combat formation permanently stationed over there. So there's not much hard power there. But let me go beyond soft power, hard power technology. A lot of times these are excuses. Remember the offsets.
Yes.
We're going to offset unfavorable balances of power by making things up. But what about stated policy and leadership? The great anti-deterrent moment that took place in this room, 70-something years ago, was when Dean Acheson gave a speech here and left Korea outside of the realm of vital U.S. national security interests in Asia. We don't know if there's causality, but we do know it was an anti-deterrence moment. We seem to have had anti-deterrence moments in the run-up to Ukraine. We often seem to take pains, the administration, to say all the things we would not do in response to something. And we didn't say much about what we would do. That's changed since the nature of the invasion became so galvanizing for the international community. But what are the lessons to be learned from that, from leadership, from policy positioning, from statements of strategic intent by the country versus just having more tank ships and planes around to have their own intrinsic kind of deterrent effect?
Well, I do think what the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, says always matters a great deal. And what the Secretary of State might say, whether it's Dean Acheson in January of 1950 or whether it's Tony Blinken in January of 2022. It always matters. And the biggest sin you can commit is to, as we've learned painfully in recent years, to establish a red line that you're not prepared to enforce. My first week on the job as the Middle East staffer for the Republican staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was the week of the Syria red line debacle and the old AUMF debate. And quite infamously, President Obama set a red line, Vladimir Putin quickly violated it, and then we ran to Lavrov seeking a flawed agreement that really never did anything to stop the killing and the chaos on display in Syria. By the way, we passed that AUMF out of committee, if memory serves, and then it never got a vote on the Senate floor. You got to check me on that one because they struck this deal with the Russians. So I don't mean to diminish the role of the president and presidential rhetoric in foreign policy. I don't know. I'm looking at all the name tags in the audience, and we have some very distinguished ones. Peter, now you wrote a great book on conservative internationalism, if memory serves. I don't know if it was you or Clinton Rossiter that said when it comes to matters of foreign policy, the president is a kind of magnificent lion. He can roam freely so long as he doesn't stray far off the reservation. Well, when the president strays rhetorically off the reservation, bad things tend to happen, and our enemies tend to take advantage of it. That being said, the reason I find deterrence by denial so attractive as compared to deterrence by punishment is that in some ways it doesn't eliminate, but it reduces these calculations about presidential credibility or the likelihood of response. In other words, if you just put in place sufficient capability to deny an aggressor their objective, you don't have to make all these strident statements about punishment in order to deter. And indeed, part of the reason I was so attracted to the 2018 National Defense Strategy and why Secretary Mattis, Bridge Colby, and President Trump deserve credit for that document is because it was not only prioritizing China and the Indo-Pacific appropriately for the first time in a long time, I sort of interpret it as trying to shift our posture as one of deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial in the Indo-Pacific. And to the extent that we are now moving towards this posture of integrated deterrence, I fear it's going to amount to us walking away from that constructive concept of deterrence by denial, which I will say, just so that I'm not purely partisan here, I think a legitimate criticism of the previous administration is that we did not implement that strategy. We did not resource that strategy. And now we are indeed on the cusp of perhaps what could be described as the third failed pivot to the Pacific in IRO. And I know that phrase is controversial because it implies that you're going to ignore other regions of the world. But the point, I think the fundamental point is a good one, which is that the Indo-Pacific is where our primary adversary lives, and the Eurasian rimland is the most important geostrategic territory, and we need to prioritize accordingly.
Well, let me pick up on this concept of trend lines through multiple administrations. Do you feel we have a good idea about how to use the military and support its use? There's been, the air has been full of disengagement over the past 3 administrations. Presidents have wanted to end wars, not start them since 2009. It was almost a contest between the current president and his predecessor to see who could get out of Afghanistan the fastest. And the way in which we got out ended up being a credibility draining moment for the United States. You hear now, including from among many conservative nationalists and patriots, themes about the use of the military that we used to associate with the anti-war Berkeley left. You know, why should we do something abroad when we have problems at home? Why should we spend money abroad when there's so many needs at home? Who are we to tell others what to do? They have their own traditions and long-standing and so on. And that surprised me a little bit. There's always choices to make in foreign policy, and there's a venerable tradition on the right of non-interventionism, going back to Taft and Washington's farewell address. It was at different times, of course. But now it seems that people want to thank me for my service in the airport, but then they want to express regret I had to do my service out there.
Yeah.
And I always tell them, I'm like, well, that's where we do our work. We play away games. It's better to play away games. So do we have a bipartisan wrong-headed sentiment right now that would be needed to support deterrence, forward presence, muscular engagement? It seems the American sentiment across the political spectrum right now is more of a World War II sentiment. Let's bring the boys home. Of course, it's not just boys anymore, but it strikes me as a wrong strategic sentiment for a strategy of engagement and deterrence in a world that's not getting more peaceable. Or am I making too much of that?
No, I don't think you are. You said something very interesting. I've always thought, whenever I hear these arguments about we need to bring the boys home, although we don't use that phrase anymore,
right.
That was certainly the sentiment from 1946 to 1950 until we got mugged by geopolitical reality after the Atchison Statement. It wasn't just the war in Korea. I mean, think about you had the Soviet nuclear test in 1949. You had a series of domestic spying cases. There was a great there's a great article about, I forget, it was like by a guy named Wells about the toxin before the fire, where he talks about all these things just hitting the United States like a series of hammer blows, and it finally culminates in Korea. But we go through these cycles of disengagement and then finally having to rearm on less favorable terms. But your comment about us fighting away games, when I was in my 20s in a uniform and a brand new, hard-charging second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, the last place I wanted to be was in garrison, in Camp Pendleton, especially not 29 Palms or Camp Lejeune.
Yeah.
It was the last place I wanted to be. I think, well, one, I subscribe to the what we could call the reluctant crusader hypothesis, that there's always been this tension in conservative foreign policy, this desire to embark on noble crusades internationally, but a reluctance to pay the costs, right? And if you sort of think about warfare since World War II, I think that explains a lot of the tension in U.S. foreign policy. But I wonder if the categories we use, isolationists versus internationalists, aren't too simplistic.
Sure.
I mean, you mentioned Taft, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Taft loses the nomination to who in 1940? Wendell Willkie, who ran explicitly on an interventionist platform, the only Republican. He gets it at the convention, loses to Dewey in 48, loses to Eisenhower in 52, and Eisenhower runs because, of course, he is a more internationalist candidate. But even Taft, Mr. Republican, who did vote against NATO, but he did it in part because he was concerned that it subverted Congress's war-making authority. Supported, albeit reluctantly, the Marshall Plan, supported, albeit reluctantly, the Truman Doctrine. Ultimately, in a very noble fashion at the convention, decided to support Eisenhower and his entire platform. And then on the other side, though we look, I think, back at Eisenhower with rose-colored glasses, and I'm a huge Eisenhower fan, and I'm glad he's climbed the rankings.
But he substituted nukes for hard power.
Exactly.
He wanted to save on hard power.
But
his offset was nuclear power.
Yeah, but he was willing to wield it very aggressively, right? I mean, very aggressive. I mean, part of it, I object to the whole Ike's bluff book because in some cases he wasn't necessarily bluffing. In other words, he had a good hand he could play and might have been willing to play. But I think we sort of, we mischaracterize him on the other side of the ledger.
Are there lessons
sometimes
for today? I mean, here's the difference to my mind. Next summer is the 50th anniversary of the all-volunteer force.
Yes.
I wonder if it'll even if it'll be noticed. I hope it's celebrated. So now for half a century, we'll have had a small all-volunteer professional force that, as you know, having served in, and I have having served in, anybody else served, it's pretty exquisite. It's really good. I was talking with Rick Atkinson, who wrote this great trilogy about the U.S. Army in World War II, and I said, who would you rather served with? Because he was deployed with me in Desert Storm, with Petraeus and Rocky Freedom. He wrote a book about the Vietnam generation. He wrote a book about World War II. And he said, oh, the current guys. He said, it's just like in World War II, they try to run a quarter of a mile on a workout. They get tired. They sit down, smoke a pack of Chesterfields. They were all malnourished. He said they're the greatest generation because they won despite those handicaps. But he said the current guys are so exquisitely trained, equipped, really good. So we've got this small all-volunteer force. Most people downrange are triple volunteers in some ways in most units. And yet when the president pulled us out of Afghanistan, he lamented having to have people go through the trauma of having to do their professional duty downrange. He says, it's really awful, everybody's traumatized, we all need to come home and rest a bit, to paraphrase his speech. So do we have, as the Brits would say, the bottle to support as a nation a muscular, not reckless, but prudent engagement with the world that may require some sacrifice and some fighting at times?
I think we do, but I do think it requires us to engage seriously with the arguments that the so-called isolationists, and I've just tried to problematize that language, are making. Because I do think there are some important points, and I do think prudence is a healthy instinct when it comes to geopolitics, right? I do think it's fair to say that the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan were inconclusive and financially ruinous, and there were multiple mistakes made throughout all phases of the war.
Right.
We should grapple with that seriously. We did not deliver, I think, adequately. And we can't expect the American people to support such an inconclusive outcome without the president explaining, okay, here, we're gonna keep 2,500, 5,000 troops there, and here's what they're going to do and why it's a good investment. The American people are not idiots, all right? If a president levels with them, I think they will understand. We never got a serious, sincere argument like that. Furthermore, I do think that the isolationists are right to criticize bureaucratic bloat in the Pentagon.
Right.
I don't think anyone's going to defend
Mission creep,
mission
overreach,
creep, mirror
like
imaging,
that.
the fact that we trained the Afghans to fight like we fight and didn't think about, okay, what happens when there isn't a huge logistical tail of contractors in the country?
Right.
All legitimate questions to be asked. I think the path forward, however, between, let's say, the Scylla of overextension and the Charybdis of naive Fortress America thinking is obvious. And there's room for a lot of people in that, between those poles. One, it's to emphasize that our strategy is fundamentally a defensive strategy. We're trying to defend the frontiers of freedom. It's sort of a distinction between democracy promotion and defense of existing democracies and partners and allies against authoritarians, whether they're in Beijing or Moscow and Tehran. Two, I do think through painful trial and error in Afghanistan, in Iraq, even in Syria, we've arrived at a sustainable operational approach, whereby with a small footprint and a sort of a light footprint, we can have a massive impact on the ground, working by, with, and through partners who are willing to fight.
Right.
I mean, the idea that the Ukrainians may have sunk a Russian warship with U.S. intelligence and sophisticated UK weaponry, or their own weaponry in this case, that's very exciting. That gives us a ton of options.
Right.
Look at the urban combat in Mosul that a very elite part of the Iraqi military carried out. Some of the worst urban combat since Waste City in 1968. A lot of options for us to have an economy of force effort in the Middle East and Europe. And finally, I would say this tension in the Republican Party that still exists, right? But I would argue Trump was not an isolationist. Just as I've argued Taft was not a pure isolationist. I think it's resolved in part by the China challenge. I don't see as much daylight between those factions when it comes to China. And I think Putin has resolved whatever difference existed on Russia. In fact, I think he's put to bed this naive idea that we can somehow triangulate Russia against China. I think even the isolationists would have to concede there's no prospect of that happening in the next decade.
Well, let's talk about China. I think it's the greater threat by far, because it offers an alternative system in the round, an alternative economic system, an alternative political system, and an alternative to much of the rest of the world. You wrote a piece called The Sources of Chinese Conduct, I think modeled on the great George Kennan piece about the Soviet Union. What point were you trying to make there? Because it struck me when I was reading, as you were saying, this is not just a run-of-the-mill regional expansionist power. There's something more going on here that we need to be attended to in the U.S. Well, but what was the point you were trying to reach there?
Well, I should say it was exactly like the Long Telegram or the Mr. X article, except nobody read it at all, besides you, Dr. Dillon. It had no impact on policy.
I had to go like 9 Google pages deep to get to it. Yeah, it was tough.
And truth be told, I mean, I was a Middle East guy, an Arabist, and it was my good friend Matt Pottinger that told me, starting in 2015 when I was working on a presidential campaign, and then when I got elected in 2016, that I really had to spend some time studying China. And so once a month we'd have breakfast, and I would just take notes about everything he said.
He's great on
And then
China,
over a year and a half, it resulted in that article. So I stole his work and then pawned it off as my own. The point I was trying to make, I do think is similar to the point Kennan was trying to make in both of those works, which is that I don't think there can be a modus vivendi with the Chinese Communist Party as currently constituted. I think this is a expansionist power that is set on not just undermining, but in some ways destroying the US-led global order as we currently conceive it. And until we grapple with that fact, until we grapple with the fact that we are in the early stages of a new Cold War and we're losing, either because we've been complacent or we don't believe we deserve to win because of some odd self-flagellating beliefs that have percolated domestically here in America, I think it's going to get pretty grim pretty quickly. And we tend to think about this as a long-term competition, and I get that. You know, Pillsbury wrote a famous book that was the 100-year marathon. It could be a marathon, or it could be over with a quick sprint that results in the CCP taking over Taiwan by force. And it strikes me that the national security establishment right now is not attacking this problem with the appropriate set of urgency. The system is blinking red. The former Indo-PACOM commander telling us this could happen in the next 5 years. The CNO, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, agreeing. Professors, Jerry Hendricks has written extensively on this and brilliantly about this. Andrew Erickson at the War College calling this the decade of maximum danger. Even Biden in his UN speech calling this the decisive decade. If this is the decisive decade,
Why aren't we doing anything about it?
why are we divesting to invest in technology that won't become available until the 2030s? We're not attacking it with a sense of urgency. We do not have a coherent plan to defend Taiwan at present, and that's what worries me.
You said at the Reagan Library we were sleepwalking, which is a famous, very good book about how people got into World War I. You said we're sleepwalking in Asia. What would have us not sleepwalk in this? What could be done today to provide a credible deterrence for Taiwan? I myself think that the best deterrence that's been provided for China vis-a-vis Taiwan is being provided by what's happening in Ukraine. I think the Chinese are likely surprised by, this is a difficult business, taking over a neighbor, especially we got to get across a patch of water to get there. And if the neighbor is well-armed, supported, the world community galvanizes around it, and so on. But they'll also have worked all those lessons learned into this thing. So the perimeter will be, the perimeter won't be on the border. The perimeter will be much further out. So what could be done today?
Well, I would say that that's a crucial point you brought up, because there are a lot of people that are suggesting, both at the highest levels of the Navy and the intelligence community, that what's happening in Ukraine and the unexpected friction that Putin's encountering is sort of a brushback pitch to Xi Jinping. I don't subscribe to that, or at least I haven't seen evidence of that, or I would just say that it depends entirely on what lessons we learned and how we apply those lessons. If we learned the fundamental lesson, which is that we need to arm Taiwan to the teeth yesterday, then yes, I think that's true. Because you're right, the CCP will go to school on Putin's failures, and we shouldn't be confident that they're going to recapitulate the same failures. And oh, by the way, though Taiwan may be easier geographically to defend, the very geographic attributes that make it easier to defend make it harder to resupply.
Exactly. The anti-access zone will be right outside the harbor in Guam.
We've also just burned through 7 years worth of javelins in Ukraine, 30% of our Stinger inventory. This is a huge problem. So that gets to the point of what we need to do to avert a disastrous outcome, in my opinion, profiting from the work of Jerry and many others. Well, if you look at what the PLA has done in the last decade and a half, I think the most striking thing, it's not just that they built the world's largest Navy. This idea that the SecNav recently said that, okay, they may build more ships, but their ships aren't as capable. I totally disagree. If you look at the Liu Yangs and the Renhais, those are very, very capable ships. So that it would be a fantasy to suggest that just because we have more capable ships in some cases, that we are adequately positioned to defend Taiwan. But what they've really done is built an anti-Navy with the PLA rocket force, right? That can hold our ships at risk at low cost. So what do we need to do to counter that? First thing we need is stand-in forces. You need forces that can exist inside the weapons engagement zone in order to flip the script on them and target their ships at a very low cost. Those are largely submarines, those are Marines armed with long-range fires, and those are special operators doing all sorts of spooky things, at times collaborating with Blue Navy, Green Marine Corps, and Black SOF, doing all sorts of fun things. The second thing, which gets to the fact that we're running low on munitions, we need to stockpile our munitions right now. And we need to take advantage of the fact that Trump rightly got out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, so we're no longer bound by the strictures of that. And of course, China was not a signatory to the INF Treaty, in order to do things like putting containerized fires all over the first and second island chain in order to complicate the PLA's decision-making cycle. Beyond that, we really need to get aggressive in terms of garrisoning and hardening all U.S. bases and territories in Indo-PACOM. And oh, by the way, not to knock on the Army, John, but I'd like to stoke conflict with you at times. The Army's primary joint mission is ground-based intercept. We need low-cost interceptors in order to protect our bases. We can't do that right now. So those are three things I would prioritize. And if I were going to divest to invest, I would be thinking of what is the crazy Apollo 13 strategy that accomplishes those three things in the short term, so I can make budgetary room for my long-term investments.
Well, the Army's pretty I was just out of Schofield Barracks a couple of weeks ago. The Army's pretty underinvested in Indo-PACOM. It doesn't have much to come to the fight with, although what they do is small but mighty. But you think, well, that doesn't seem like a proportional response to our #1 national security challenge. Let me touch on two other threat scenarios very quickly, because I want to end with some time, you can talk about the piece you have in the current issue of National Review about the woke military and why that might matter. Iran. And Iran seems to have fallen into this category. Not only you alluded to the fact that they're a potential ally, because for some reason we want to conclude an Iran nuclear deal with them, but also they seem to have fallen into a category we like to have as a country, which is, oh good, because we're not thinking about it anymore, they can't be a threat to the region.
That's right.
I don't hear that from my Arab friends over there. And having been the guy who ran the Gulf Security Dialogue for several years, I have a lot of Arab friends and they have my ear. So who's right? Our current thinking or our friends in the region?
Our friends in the region are right. I would say a few things about this. Well, one, President Biden, when he was campaigning, promised that if they were to resurrect the Iran deal, they would get a longer and stronger agreement. There is no universe in which a JCPOA 2.0 will be longer and stronger than JCPOA 1.0. And JCPOA 1.0 was not long and strong enough. We've already blown past many of the sunset provisions that were in that agreement. They are in the rear view mirror. This would give international legitimacy to Iran's industrial strength nuclear program. Point one. Point two, as I alluded to before, the only way I can make sense of the Middle East, or the only way I can nudge us towards a more sustainable strategy in the region that doesn't involve us deploying thousands and thousands of troops to the region or just doing counterterrorism whack-a-mole everywhere, is to build off the basic framework that is the Abraham Accords. And what's happening right now is pretty exciting in terms of historic levels of cooperation between Israel and the Sunni Arab Gulf states. And we've never seen some of this stuff that's happening right now.
The case was made by the earlier panel when you were traveling that one of the reasons is that it's because they think they may need to trust Israel more than us. Because we're just not as trustworthy.
I made the case. I made the case in 2015 that it was sort of like the best of times, worst of times for Middle East policy. I mean, the best of times because we were starting to see that historic cooperation. The worst of times was because that was a de facto alliance built in opposition to U.S. strategy in the region.
They were cooperating because we lost interest.
We were actively trying to approach with.
I was in Japan a couple years ago when they were debating revising their constitution to push more towards being able to go nuclear. And I said, boy, I was talking with the number 3 guy in the Japanese foreign minister. I said, you guys must be really worried about China. He said, you idiot, this is not about China. This is about you. We don't think we can rely on you. That's why we've got to think about it. So sometimes it is about us.
Yeah.
We got to tell. So in the last couple of minutes we have, you have a piece in the current issue of National Review, our story, our issue dedicated to military-related things, on the dangers of a woke military, and I would just say the philosophy of wokeness in a place like the U.S. military, which in many ways is built to be against the whole idea of divisive identity politics and separating things out in that way. Why did you feel compelled to say it in a national magazine of opinion? And isn't this all just a contrived culture war game, as President Obama said when he came out to campaign for the Virginia gubernatorial candidate last fall? Why did you feel it's actually being used by our adversaries against us and can weaken our security posture?
Well, let me confess that was my initial instinct. You don't see me on like Fox News throwing rhetorical bombs. I'm not like, I don't wake up trying to fight the culture war every day. I do hard power, defense, intelligence is kind of my thing. But the more I sort of observed what was going on in the Pentagon, and the more I heard from active duty folks that I keep in touch with, the more I became convinced that this was a huge problem. And I would make a few points. One, I think it's empirically true that the growing DEI bureaucracy has, in some cases, destroyed institutions of higher learning that previously promoted free inquiry and now promote the exact opposite. It's happening in K-12 education as well, and so I think logically we should be very suspicious of that same bureaucracy gaining a foothold in the Pentagon and expanding. And it is expanding rapidly. That's not some right-wing talking point. It is an actual fact that bureaucracy is expanding rapidly. Second, it's based on bad social science. If you look at the Navy's Task Force 1 Navy, report, where it's sort of its foundational DEI text. It makes this claim that diversity is our strength, and the CNO repeated this strength. Okay, I think we'd all concede that the fact that we live in a diverse country, and that by extension we have a diverse military, and by the way, the Navy is more diverse than the rest of the population, is on balance a good thing, right? That's an asset, particularly when we're dealing with an adversary who is racist in China. That is on balance a good thing, but it cannot be an organizing principle for the Pentagon. And there's no empirical support for the idea that diversity defined exclusively in race and gender terms will improve team performance. The Navy cites a McKinsey study called Diversity Matters from 2015, where they compare, they suggest there's a correlation between board diversity for publicly traded companies and financial performance. But first of all, how they define board diversity is absurd if you look at this crazy formula they have. And second, they break the data set into quartiles, but they only compare the top quartile to the bottom quartile. They omit half the data set.
Yep.
Bad social science. The other study they cite is based on fake stock trades in examining price bubbles in financial markets. That's not even applicable to the financial world, let alone the specific business of asking young men and women to kill and be killed for their country. And final thing, I'm sorry to go on, John, I do think this is going to be very divisive in the Pentagon and detract from readiness and a relentless focus on warfighting.
Yeah,
That is my
and the
primary
ethos
concern.
of team building to do war fighting. This seems to be the opposite of team building.
Or create race consciousness or racial essentialism where it didn't exist before.
Right.
I mean, the military
The
integrated in
great
1948.
success story of
Yeah.
racial integration now being told to discredit itself in many ways.
You talked about Korea. Korea was probably the first war where you had these highly integrated units. Read Owen's Colder Than Hell, a memoir of the Korean War by a Marine rifle platoon up at Chosin Reservoir. He talks about it. He says, okay, yeah, there were some people that were uncomfortable, but the overwhelming feeling was that the politicians had hollowed out the military. We needed every man we could get. A Marine was a Marine. That's the sentiment we need, not sort of Ibram X. Kendi theology transmuted onto the military.
Right. Well, it's a great article, and there's a lot of other wisdom besides what you've heard here in that, so I would recommend that highly. Can you join me in thanking Congressman Mike Gallagher for joining us today? Thank you.
You headed off?
Yep.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to be joined by Senator Tom Cotton, and some people may not know or have forgotten that when the senator first came to public attention, there was actually a controversy over whether he existed or not, because he was serving in Iraq, and he wrote a letter criticizing the New York Times exposing a secret program, and the left's like, this guy, he doesn't exist. You're telling me there's a Harvard-educated, officer who can write this sort of letter and has a sort of viewpoint. So actually, Snopes had to address this controversy, and I referred back to this here. I'll just read this little passage. Much discussion has since ensued, after the letter was published, over whether Lieutenant Cotton is a real person, especially since Tom Cotton is also the name of a hobbit who appears in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I mean, there is that. But earlier news accounts, such as this article from the Houston Chronicle, do indeed describe a Houston man, I have to clean that up, named Thomas Cotton, who left a law practice in January 2005 to enlist in the Army and train at Officer Candidate School. So this turned out to be very good news, because if Tom Cotton didn't exist, we would have had to go the trouble of inventing him. He, in my mind, is one of the most acute and prescient folks that we have on Capitol Hill. During Trump's first impeachment, if you remember that one, if he gets reelected again, there'll be a third. I mean, we're going to lose count. But he'd come out every day after the deliberations in the Senate chamber and say, look, everyone's got to pay attention to this thing called the coronavirus, which is in China, and we need to take it seriously, and we can't trust the Chinese. At a time when social media was suppressing the idea that the virus might have emanated from a lab, Senator Cotton was saying, I think this thing might have come from a lab because we can't trust the Chinese. You see, there's a common theme here. And the senator really proved his worth by nearly destroying the New York Times editorial department simply by writing the piece they had commissioned him to write during the BLM riots. We can only imagine what would happen if the New York Times were ever to accept a freelance submission by Tom Cotton. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Tom Cotton.
Well, thank you, Rich, for the very kind introduction and the walk down memory lane. Thank you all for the warm welcome. It's great to be back with the National Review Institute. I was invited today to speak about what a conservative foreign policy ought to look like. When you ask what a conservative this or that is, it raises a more basic question. What are we conserving? I usually look at our founding to answer that question, in this case to our Constitution. The preamble says that we established our government to, among other things, secure the blessings of liberty. What are those blessings of liberty? Simply enough, I would suggest they are our safety, freedom, and prosperity. So how do we conserve those things? Well, that's the key question, but it's not one that we can answer in the abstract, nor should we try to. Conservatives, after all, should avoid abstractions in favor of concrete, tangible reality. Foreign policy, especially a conservative foreign policy, is foremost the realm of prudential judgment and reasoning. In every case, there's 101 different considerations to take into account. Foreign policy is emphatically not the province of doctrines. It's hard to imagine something less conservative than a doctrine applicable to every foreign policy issue we may face. Even the most famous doctrine of all, the Monroe Doctrine, authored by the great John Quincy Adams, applied specifically and concretely to the threat posed by reactionary European monarchies attempting to recolonize independent nations in our hemisphere. While the doctrine is still highly relevant today and suggests a series of policies to address new circumstances, especially China's meddling in Latin America, it didn't purport to guide America's foreign policy regarding, say, North Africa or East Asia. So let us discard the search for grand and abstract doctrines. It's an idle and fruitless endeavor, usually indulged by professors and journalists who don't know better. Sorry, no offense. Of course, prudential reasoning doesn't mean unprincipled reasoning. The exact opposite, actually. We always get back to that basic principle of securing the blessings of liberty. The question itself is the principled guide in each practical case. What course of action will keep America safe? What will preserve our freedom? What will promote widespread, durable prosperity? I believe these are the questions that our greatest conservative statesmen have always asked and oriented their foreign policy around. Men like George Washington, John Quincy Adams, and Ronald Reagan. Their answers, of course, seem to be very different on the surface. But this is exactly my point about prudential reasoning in foreign policy. Circumstances matter a lot. Let me give you an example. Some like to cite as a guide today Washington's farewell address, with its warning against permanent alliances and recommendation for as little political connection as possible with other nations. That address was a great pronouncement by a great statesman, but it addressed very specific circumstances in 1796. A young, weak, and fragile America, a Europe convulsed by the French Revolution, and fairly primitive military and communications technology, at least by today's standards. If he were with us today, Washington wouldn't excuse lazy, sloppy thinking that takes his concrete policy recommendations then and simply grafts them onto today's world. The farewell address itself is seeded with suggestions to the contrary. Washington referred to our detached and distant situation, and he lauded the advantages of so peculiar a situation, and rightly so in 1796. But does anyone really think that such a practical, hard-nosed statesman as Washington would assess our situation the same today? I very much doubt it. That's why his farewell address should still guide us today, though not in any kind of automatic or reflexive way. The farewell address also carries a significant element of time. As he put it, the period is not far off when America would stand up, gather strength, and have freedom of action in the world. This point is important, so I think it's worth quoting at length. With me, Washington explained, a predominant motive has been to endeavor to gain time to our country to settle and mature its yet recent institutions and to progress without interruption to that degree of strength and consistency which is necessary to give it, humanly speaking, the command of its own fortunes. In other words, Washington foresaw a time when our policy might change, probably should change, based on changed circumstances. A good example, which again gets back to my point about prudential reasoning, came a quarter century later with John Quincy Adams and the Monroe Doctrine. In Washington's time, we probably lacked the strength to pursue such a policy, even had it been needed. But by Washington's presidency, by Monroe's presidency, circumstances had changed. We had gained enough strength to implement a new policy that was needed, given the currents of European politics. Or to say the same thing differently, we had reached enough of a modus vivendi with Great Britain after the War of 1812 that we could rely on its naval power and its aligned interests with us against continental Europe to help enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It was a masterstroke of clear-eyed diplomacy. I have to say, by the way, that I am surprised that some people invoke John Quincy Adams as a patron saint of a restrained and passive foreign policy. I suspect he would be too. For the 12 years he was at the helm, first as Secretary of State and then as President, America had an activist foreign policy, as one would expect from such a brilliant strategist. When it comes to foreign policy, to borrow from the legendary Bill Rood, you run the show where the show runs you. Even with America still young and relatively weak, Adams was all about running the show. So was Reagan, another brilliant strategist. Despite our reverence for the great man, I have to say, I still think we don't fully appreciate his greatness at times. For many years, Soviet Russia had run the show, putting America and the forces of freedom on the back foot. Reagan seized the initiative back from the Russians so completely and ran the show so effectively that the Soviet Union disintegrated barely a decade later. Now, on a certain level, Reagan's foreign policy seems to break sharply with Washington and Adams. We had allies all around the rimland of Europe, Eurasia, I should say, bound by treaty and honor to go to war with them. We went abroad and destroyed monsters in far-flung corners of the globe. Everywhere you turn, Reagan confronted and challenged our enemies again and again. But at a deeper level, Reagan had the same foreign policy as Washington and Adams, all things considered. As I've stressed, they must be. He surveyed the world and acted to secure the blessings of liberty for America. We faced a committed, old world power with a fanatical globalist ideology grafted on top of it. Military and communications technology had advanced to the point that we couldn't expect time to gather our strength and rally our allies when the war began. In fact, thanks to the rise of global precision strike weapons, We might not even realize the war had begun. Under these circumstances, Reagan did exactly what I believe Washington and Adams would have done. He rebuilt our military strength from its shocking lows of the 1970s. As Washington suggested, military strength is always preferable to military weakness. Only the strong can survive in a dangerous world. Only the strong can preserve their freedom. And for that matter, only the strong can protect the weak, and only the strong can afford to be merciful. Reagan understood that in modern times, America depends on beachheads and lodgements of freedom around the world to protect ourselves right here at home. Reagan was not blind to our allies' shortcomings. Still, he understood, as Churchill said, the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting without them. And Reagan also supported the forces of freedom around the world to pressure Soviet Russia, which tried to undermine them around the world. Whether a friendly government facing a communist insurgency or freedom fighters resisting a communist government, Reagan never confused America's friends with our enemies, nor drew a moral equivalence between the two. But Reagan also never confused means with ends. Reagan oriented his policy based on America's interests, on the need to protect our safety, our freedom, and our prosperity. For example, he supported solidarity and the Contras, not for their sake, but for ours. Yes, he admired them and he wanted Poland and Nicaragua to live in freedom, but his prime motive was always America's freedom. Reagan destroyed plenty of monsters in places like Grenada in the Middle East, but he did so to protect America. All of these actions were, to borrow again from the farewell address, in our interest, guided by justice. And I would add, if you don't think John Quincy Adams would have invaded Grenada under these circumstances, you don't know much about John Quincy Adams. A conservative foreign policy based on our interests, guided by justice, is a good contrast to conservative and liberal foreign policy, on which I can end. Conservatives from Washington to today have never been ashamed of acting on our interests. Who will if we don't? But liberals from Woodrow Wilson to Joe Biden think there's something embarrassing or unseemly about acting in our interests. Just 3 days after Germany killed 128 Americans by sinking the Lusitania, Wilson gave what's known as, incredibly, the too proud to fight speech. He admonished us not to think just of America first, but also of humanity first. More amazing still, he warned our nation not to have what he called the narrowness and prejudice of a family, which is less interested in the neighbors than it is in its own members. Think about how radical that metaphor is. I bet you probably care more about your family and its members than you care about your neighbor, even if you're a good neighbor. That's okay because the neighbors do too. But, according to Wilson, Americans shouldn't care more about our nation than we care for other nations. That would just be narrowness and prejudice. When Wilson finally declared war 2 years later, he made clear in his war message to Congress that America was fighting on behalf of abstractions in other nations, not, for instance, to protect American lives and shipping from unrestricted submarine warfare or to defend our southern border from invasion. Wilson famously declared that the world must be made safe for democracy. But there's one word missing there, and it gets to the heart of the difference between liberal and conservative foreign policy. I would say that the world must be made safe for America's democracy. I suspect George Washington, John Quincy Adams, and Ronald Reagan probably would have agreed. And while it's not always easy or clear in any given case under the circumstances to know just how to protect our democracy, to secure the blessings of liberty, it remains the lodestar of conservative foreign policy. I'll be happy to discuss any of those particular cases with Rich during our conversation, but for now, I want to thank the National Review Institute for all it has done over the years to secure the blessings of liberty. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the United States.
Thank you, Senator. That was tremendous. So let me start just with where public opinion is among conservatives and our friends at the moment. You're out there a lot, sort of taking what Lincoln called public opinion baths. Where are most conservatives on the question of Ukraine and Russia?
The American people, conservatives very much included, deeply oppose invasions and naked wars of aggression. That very much goes for Russia's naked war of aggression against Ukraine. The other main instance of that in my lifetime was when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. You saw similar public opinion, but the antipathy towards Russia runs very deep in the American political mind, especially
just given the history,
especially in the conservative mind. And the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 didn't really change that. And when you see this kind of war of aggression waged by a brutal dictator in which women and children are being slaughtered, then the American people, but especially conservatives, feel very strongly. And that's borne out not just in anecdotal public opinion baths across the state of Arkansas, or that my colleagues take in their states as well, but in public opinion polling as well, that Vladimir Putin and Russia are about as popular as syphilis these days. And for that matter, Joe Biden gets relatively low marks in his conduct of America's policy regarding this war so far, overwhelmingly because Americans think he is not doing enough. And again, those are polls of the American people at large, not polls of partisan Republicans. And the American people are right, by the way.
So it strikes me that the folks on the right call themselves realists or restrainers or neo-isolationists or whatever they are, partly misinterpret the Trump phenomenon. Obviously, a major break with where George W. Bush was on foreign policy, but not an isolationist, right? It was a more Jacksonian-oriented foreign policy rather than arguably a Wilsonian one under Bush. We can get into that a little bit more in a minute, but it wasn't, he did bomb the S out of ISIS just the way he promised. He pasted Soleimani when he had the opportunity, and his reflex obviously was to pull out of Afghanistan, but he never did it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say that George W. Bush's foreign policy was a mixture of Jacksonian and Wilsonian impulses. More Jacksonian in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It changed over time to be a bit more Wilsonian. You got to the second inaugural where President Bush declared that our goal was to end tyranny in the world, which is a very noble goal, but it probably is beyond the capacity of our nation and perhaps will be beyond the capacity of any nation for as long as mankind lives. The Trump policy, as you say, was much more Jacksonian. Trump, like Reagan, not to the same degree as Reagan, used the Friends of Freedom around the world to help advance our own interests. Doesn't mean that we don't stand in solidarity with Hong Kongers who've had their freedom crushed, or certainly religious and ethnic minorities in China who are facing genocide. But we also know, just like Reagan did from Soviet dissidents or Polish solidarity, that it is a deep source of weakness and insecurity in Beijing. And therefore we should push on it, because Beijing is our enemy in the same way that Moscow was our enemy back in the day. Russia has chosen to make not just Ukraine, but the Western world its enemy in 101 different ways. those are very different threats and they require very different actions. But we did nothing since 1991 that provoked Russia or Vladimir Putin into taking this action. I mean, he laid it all out well in advance of the invasion in a long essay last summer, which he basically just turned into a speech on the eve of the invasion, that he views Ukraine as a phony country that belongs to Russia and always has, going back centuries, and that he was going to restore it. And nothing America has done or refrained from doing provoked Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. I think most normal Americans know that. Again, like Americans strongly oppose invasions. They view them very differently than they view, say, civil wars in other nations.
So what would you make of the argument, again, from the other side on the right, and then also you'd hear from the left? All right, so let's say you're right about Vladimir Putin and whatnot, but we're still correct to have a real skeptical eye to what anyone says who's on the hawkish part of the spectrum, because Iraq didn't turn out the way you promised. Afghanistan, we were in it for 20 years, and as soon as we pull out, the army collapses. And obviously, you know, to your great credit, you're at the pointy end of the spear in Iraq. You were not advocating for it or voting for it in Congress at the time, but these should be discrediting events for hawks going forward.
Well, I think it's too easy oftentimes to just divide camps into hawks and doves. In many cases, foreign policy is full of ostriches as well. People that just, in both parties, just want to stick their head in the sands and ignore problems. You also have to accept the world as you find it. You know, this is a point that Bob Gates, another great conservative statesman, has made. You know, he came in very late 2006. He was not part of the decision to invade Afghanistan or invade Iraq or the early days of that, but he accepted the problems and the challenges he faced, and for instance, supported the surge in Iraq and supported the surge in Afghanistan to try to make a difference, as he writes about extensively in his memoirs. We made a lot of mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan over the years as we shifted the objectives and became more kind of Wilsonian, to use the word you chose earlier, to try to establish, you know, Western parliamentary-style democracies in countries where the soil for that kind of government had not been very fertile for many years. But those twists and turns that we took over the years, the mistakes that first President Bush made, later corrected, especially in Iraq, and that President Obama made repeatedly without ever correcting, is a lot of the kind of what caused the American people to be disappointed with the outcome and the trajectory of that war. You saw again last year, though, there's a big difference between ending a war and losing a war, and the American people were very dissatisfied with the way we ended up losing Kabul at the end.
So yeah, there's some people who've very, very skeptical of any level of aid to Ukraine whatsoever, who have been out there saying, I feel that the 2003 mood is gripping the country again, which is completely ridiculous, because the 2003 mood was directly connected to the 2001 mood, where if you were in Midtown Manhattan for months afterwards, after those attacks, you had the stench of 2 dead buildings in your nostrils, you know, every single day. And that obviously, that's why we invaded Afghanistan, was also a crucial predicate for Iraq, which wouldn't have happened in the absence of that attack, I believe.
Yeah, I just don't see that mood around the country, and I really don't see it that much in Congress. I think one of the lessons of our failures to deter this invasion in 2021 and early 2022 is a lesson that President Biden should have taken from Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, is that standing with our friends, helping them defend themselves, being clear and confident in the use of American power in all of its many tools and instruments does not lead to war, it leads to success. And you saw that time and time again with Ronald Reagan. Sometimes it was military action, such as the invasion of Grenada, which was an absolutely necessary and righteous war. Sometimes you saw it through arming other peoples, like we armed the Afghans to fight back against the Soviets. So there's a lot of different ways we can use American power, and this is an old kind of false choice that Barack Obama specialized in, and his acolytes in the administration are still doing this, that in every place we face a challenge, it's either some kind of humiliating concessions, or it's outright war with 100,000 heavy mechanized troops rolling across a foreign country's border. That's just not the case. It wasn't the case under Reagan. It wasn't the case under Trump either.
Yeah, I mean,
who did not, as you said, who did not blink from defending America's interests.
Yeah, if you have a guerrilla force or a national army that's willing to carry forward the fight against your enemies, and you don't have to be directly involved, and you just have to arm and support them, it seems...
Yeah, and there's, I mentioned about doctrines in my speech. There was, some people talked about a Reagan doctrine in arming those kind of insurgencies. I don't think Reagan ever actually used the term himself. I think, again, it was the construct of journalists and academics who always want to frame things in those terms. But he acted prudentially as the cases bore out. Same way, I mentioned about invasions. I mean, our reaction to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait is different right now than our reaction to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, even though you saw kind of equivalent levels of revulsion. Well, the circumstances are very different in those countries as well. In 1990, our prosperity still depended very much on the flow of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, which is not the case today from Ukraine. And Saddam Hussein had the world's fourth largest army, but he didn't have nuclear weapons. He certainly didn't have a nuclear arsenal in the thousands. So in each of these cases, you have to revert to prudential reasoning about the circumstances, but the guiding principle should always be, how do we secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves at home? And I think that gets back to the distinction I made about how the American people feel about invasions versus civil wars, is they kind of intuitively understand that having aggressive dictators believe they can wantonly invade other countries and reshape the political map around the world is ultimately more threatening to our safety at home than having civil wars in this, that, or the other country. And they're right about that.
So should our goal just be flat out to defeat Vladimir Putin in Ukraine?
I mean, President Zelensky has stated a very reasonable goal, which is that he'd like to get invading troops off of his soil. It's a very reasonable goal. We should help President Zelensky and the Ukrainian army achieve that goal. We shouldn't try to help them achieve something more than that. We don't want them invading and marching on Moscow, but we should stand with them as long as that remains their goal and back them to the hilt. I do worry that over time, the Biden administration, especially if pressured by certain European countries, may begin to condition the provision of arms or diplomatic and political support for Ukraine on President Zelensky being willing to cut a bad deal, which I don't think we should force upon them. President Biden also has a very bad habit of speaking loosely and freely in a way that is contrary to our interests. Early on, before the invasion, he said, well, if it's a minor incursion, maybe it won't prompt a response from NATO. Famously or infamously in Warsaw at the end of March, he said that Vladimir Putin needs to be removed from power. Look, Ronald Reagan was very tough on Soviet Russia. He confronted them everywhere, as I said in my remarks. I don't believe he ever called for the ouster of Brezhnev or Andropov or Gorbachev. Right.
Yeah, they need to get that Easter Bunny at more Biden events, waving him off. Do you have any level of fear that if Putin is looking at a frank defeat that is humiliating and potentially would represent the history of Russian rulers that have lost wars, and not a happy one, maybe he could get around it because he has almost total control of the information space in Russia, but any fear that would push him too far, push him to escalate in a way that would be much more dangerous than what's happening now and potentially draw in NATO?
I am mindful. I'm not fearful. Vladimir Putin should be fearful of what Ukraine and its allies are going to do to his army. Again, I think one real shortcoming for President Biden and some European leaders in late 2021 and early 2022 was to keep saying what we wouldn't do or what we were afraid of, as opposed to making Vladimir Putin worry about what we would do. And especially that's the case after the first 2 or 3 weeks of the war, when it became clear that his lightning strike for Kyiv to topple the government was going to fail. He is the one that should be especially fearful of what will happen in Ukraine if he doesn't find some way to get an off-ramp and withdraw from that country. I mean, it reminds me of a story about U.S. Grant after he showed up down the street at the Willard in the early spring of 1864 and took command of all Union armies, and he dealt with all these generals from the Army of the Potomac who were dealing with Stockholm Syndrome, having been beaten by Lee up and down the eastern seaboard for 2 years. And he told them that I'm hardly tired of hearing what Robert E. Lee is going to do to us. You all seem to think that he will do a backflip and a somersault and land on both of our flanks and our rear at the same time. Once you go back to your commands and decide what you are going to do to Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
And that should be the mindset that the President has and that our NATO allies have.
It's just a great story of him showing up at the Willard here down the street in his shabby uniform with his rucksack, and they wanted to give him the worst room in the hotel until they said, oh, it's U.S. Grant. And then he goes over to the reception and has to stand on the sofa so everyone can see him and hear from the great man. Truly one of the most inspiring figures in American history. So we got Russia, obviously, and then we have this major threat growing from China. How do we balance those two? Is there any zero-sum aspect to how would we prepare to deal with China versus vis-a-vis how we deal with containing Russia?
Well, I think it's important to remember they're very different kinds of threat, and China is a much graver threat. Russia is a declining power and has been for a long time. Its economy is barely two-thirds the size of Italy's. And Italy is not exactly going gangbusters, if you notice lately. It was never terribly integrated into the world economy. Now it's even less so. And its military, despite major investments over the last 15 years, has proven incapable of defeating the Ukrainian military, much less NATO's combined forces. So although that's the most urgent issue we face today, we cannot lose sight of the fact that China is very different and a much graver threat. China's economy is almost as large as ours. It is deeply integrated with the world economy and especially our economy. That has a distorting effect on our domestic politics. There's a massive China lobby all across the country in every state, every congressional district advocating for conciliation with China. Its military is rapidly expanding, both its conventional forces and its nuclear forces. So we can't lose sight of the fact that China poses the genuine threat to replace America as the dominant power in the world, even if the war in Ukraine is the most pressing issue right now. Fortunately, a lot of what we would do to deter Russia, we would do to deter China as well. Most basically, that includes reinvesting our military and building it back up, so it's not reaching the point where we reached in the late 1970s. With the kind of systems that are of great practical utility everywhere. The new stealth bomber, mass production of the F-35 stealth fighter, a large naval buildup to include a mix of surface and subsea manned combatants and unmanned combatants as well. Our nuclear modernization to include recapitalizing the entire triad or intercontinental missiles, that bomber, and the cruise missiles it will carry, and SSBN submarines that carry the ballistic missiles, but also other kinds of nuclear weapons that the Trump administration's proposed, the Biden administration has kept some, cut others, all designed to offset the 10-to-1 advantage that Russia has against us and that China may soon have against us. Those are the basic elements we can take to meet the challenge of both. With China, it'll take a lot more. It'll take more economic reform as well to help decouple strategic parts of our economy from China, so we are not funding their rise as we have for 30 years. It will require more political and diplomatic commitments, for instance, to Taiwan, and to rally and marshal ally support for Taiwan in the Western Pacific. That should be taking the lion's share of kind of the long-term strategic thinking of this administration.
So let's go back to nukes for a minute, because this is one of these areas where we've had this bizarre thinking that if we do things that make sense for our self-defense, it'll be provocative to people who are already, Russia's going way up in tactical nukes, and China's been involved in this enormous buildup and hasn't been a party to any of these arms control agreements we've had with Russia.
Jimmy Carter, nobody's idea of a strong president, had a Secretary of Defense who acknowledged this. He said, when we build, they build, and when we stop building, they build.
Right.
Our actions to defend our country are largely immaterial to countries like Russia and China. They can put pressure on them the way we put pressure in the 1980s, but it's just manifestly clear if you look at the history of arms control agreements, which are largely failures with Soviet Russia, and you look at Soviet-Russian reaction to American foreign policy in the mid-1970s to the late 1970s and how aggressive they were around the globe versus how they behaved under Reagan's administration, that the best way to counteract them is to put pressure on them and to use our economic strength turned into military might, to use our system of alliances around the world and our support for other beleaguered nations who might have aligned interests to counteract them. The idea that if we just unilaterally decide to disarm, as Bernie Sanders would do with our missiles, he would defund our entire modernization of our intercontinental missiles, which are 50 years old. And he wouldn't just save the money, he'd give it to Tony Fauci and the CDC. And the name of the bill with which he'd do that is the Investing in Cures Before Missiles Act, the ICBM Act.
That's clever.
You can't even make
It's
it
clever,
up.
yeah.
But Russia would Russia and especially China would simply pocket those gains and laugh at us and continue to add hundreds of more missile silos in Western China as they're doing right now.
So speaking of laughing at us, let's talk a little bit more about decoupling and the defense industrial base. One thing you focused on, among many others in this area, is rare earths, where I'm going to get the details wrong, but in broad strokes, this is what happened. General Electric had a rare earth concern. It sells it to a Chinese or partly owned Chinese company. All of it's sucked over there. They're happy to have it. I'm sure they subsidize it. We have one rare earth mine in the entire United States. We don't produce any rare earth. It's in California, and I thought this was kind of interesting. At least there's one left, and it's in California. So I wanted one of our writers to go there and do a big on-the-scene report. And the word came back, Rich, actually that rare earth mine is partly owned by China, and they don't want National Review showing up there or writing about it. But rare earths are extremely important to a modern economy and to our weapons, among other things.
Yeah, very, very important to both the economy and our defense. Ironically, they're not terribly rare at all. You might be able to go up and down to the mall and dig some up. What is rare is the actual mining of them, which we really don't do in America, except for that one mine out in California, and certainly the processing and the refining of them, which is done predominantly in China today. And that's the kind of thing of which we need to be mindful. China cut off Japan from rare earths in 2010 in a dispute over the Senkaku Islands temporarily. So there's always that threat hanging over America and other countries. But also it can just be a matter of supply chain. And the more demand for these elements in China, the more likely those companies in China processing them are going to sell first to those companies in China, the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, as opposed to sell to our automobile manufacturers or other industries. So it's an example of something that's very urgent, that we develop diversified alternative supply chains, from getting it out of the ground to processing it into final product ready to ship to OEMs. It's not going to happen overnight, but it needs to start now. And this kind of thing that we can no longer be dependent upon China for.
How about semiconductors?
We aren't terribly dependent on China for semiconductors. Unfortunately, the most advanced semiconductors in the world are made on an island that's 100 miles from mainland China, against which it has longstanding irredentist claims. So that's just another reason why we should make it very clear to China that we will not tolerate the invasion of Taiwan, which will happen. China will invade Taiwan.
Invade.
China will invade Taiwan if America doesn't take steps now to deter it. Partly that means arming Taiwan faster and more effectively than we have. It means working with their Ministry of Defense to reform their military, especially their reserve and mobilization practices. And it means adopting what's called strategic clarity, just stating outright to Beijing, we will come to Taiwan's aid. Our policy for 40 years has been strategic ambiguity. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Circumstances, again, have changed a lot. Ambiguity served us once, clarity would serve us now. If we don't take those steps, China will invade Taiwan, certainly in the next 5 years in Xi Jinping's third term, maybe much sooner than that. In the meantime, while we're doing all that, we should do as much as we can to get TSMC to start building semiconductor fabs, hopefully in America, but also outside of missile range of mainland China.
So do you get the sense that Taiwan is taking this threat seriously enough? Because when I've delved into this area, it's kind of shocking that they seem to be buying the wrong sort of stuff, and their preparedness is not a very high level, which, if you're Germany, and maybe the Germans have finally gotten religion on this, it's understandable. You're closeted within the Western alliance. Russia's going to have to go through a number of countries before it gets to you, and it's not coming to you anyway. But that's not true of Taiwan. Do the Taiwanese take this with the requisite seriousness?
So I I think a lot of their elected leaders do. I think Tsai Ing-wen does. Some of their national security bureaucracy, not quite. You're right that they don't always focus on the most effective tools to deter a Chinese invasion or to defeat it should it happen. You know, there used to be a saying in American politics, a chicken in every pot. Well, in Taiwan, they should probably have a stinger in every garage ready for the Chinese invasion. Likewise, they need more anti-ship missiles or more advanced smart mines for the invading force. As I said, they need a stronger reserve system. They need the kind of reserve system that small countries next to hostile neighbors like Israel and Finland have, as opposed to focusing more on their standing army. These are steps that they need to take. They've needed to take them for a while. I hope the invasion of Ukraine shows them the urgency of taking them. I mean, in some ways, China's operation to invade Taiwan would be harder because of the stopping power of water. But by the same token, it would be much harder for us to arm Taiwan after an invasion than it is in Ukraine, because China can impose a naval and aerial embargo on Taiwan.
And are we in a position to defend Guam at the moment?
Yes, although we could be in a better position to defend it. And we need to make it clear that we treat Guam in the same way we treat the continental United States. We need to make that clear to Beijing.
So we just have a couple minutes left. There's multi-layered threats, and one of them is from within, ideological threat to this country's standing and to just common sense and training in the military, which is DEI, which the military spends an inordinate amount of time on, arguably to the exclusion of really important things like knowing how to put a fire out on a ship. How do we combat this?
Well, we've had some initiatives in the Congress. I think we're going to have more next year when we take back the majorities. But we need a new Republican president, Secretary of Defense, that just puts an end to it.
That you can just do that just by edict. You're not doing
the new Secretary of Defense he can just write his own little PowerPoint page. You know, the Armed Forces of the United States are an equal opportunity employer, and we have a zero tolerance policy for any kind of harassment based on race or ethnicity or sex or religion or anything else. That's basically what it was when I was in the Army. And we all knew what EO was. We all knew what EO training was, and we got refresher training on it periodically.
And it was an institution that was a model in this.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the Army has an extremely distinguished record. I mean, the military as a whole, Army just the biggest part of it, and the oldest part of it, has an extremely distinguished record of racial progress. You know, the Army was integrated shortly after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. African Americans serve in the military in higher proportions than they're present in the population as a whole, and especially at some of the higher ranks of the non-commissioned officer corps, which is the backbone of our military. Not exactly an institution that's racked by systemic racism. And we need civilian leaders, the President, the Secretary of Defense, service secretaries as well, who make that clear, that we expect soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines to spend the vast bulk of their time learning their craft, honing their skills, and preparing to fight and win a war.
So final question, we'll conclude here. So are you optimistic about the long-term prospects of the United States, and why?
I am very optimistic about the long-term prospects because of the dynamism of our people and the nature of our system. Some people might say that our system is true because it works. I'd say it works because it's true. It's a system of government that's built on the unchanging nature of man, and it reflects the ability to seize what is best in the human soul and to elevate it and to help people capitalize on it, as opposed to what you see in governments like China and Russia. Does that mean it's inevitable? No, it's not. I mean, to go back to our contrast between conservatives and liberals, we don't believe in history with capital H. There is no arc to history. There is no wrong or right side of history in the sense that it's predetermined as opposed to made by men and women at critical times. And I think we have a lot of reasons to be optimistic, but those are not foreordained. They're not inevitable. Ultimately, American decline would be a choice made by and imposed on us by liberals. But that's why it's so imperative that we as conservatives stand up, make the case, win elections, and govern effectively.
Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Cotton. Great job. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been remiss. I was supposed to dismiss all of you. So consider yourselves dismissed, and we're going to adjourn and have some cocktails. So please join us for cocktails and conversation. Thank you very much.